Well, Silksong is still not out, so I decided to replay Hollow Knight, because it is good, and I mean it is really good. And to me, one of the biggest highlights of the game, outside of course, the character design, level design, world progression, music, atmosphere, minimalistic storytelling, the movement system, and every single word that comes out of Elderbug's mouth, is the game's boss fights. The boss fights in Hollow Knight are absolutely incredible. Even though movesets are often limited, the fights always carry an incredible weight to them with some gorgeous characterizing animations. And though some fights are simple, often boasting only 2 or 3 attacks, others represent some of the most mechanically demanding bosses in this genre. As a heads up, most of this footage came from a challenge run I posted a little bit ago, using an unupgraded nail and no charms or magic, so if you're looking at this footage and wondering why I'm not healing when I have huge windows, or why I'm sitting around with my soul gauge full, that's why. Like with my From Software videos, I'd like to analyze the bosses of Hollow Knight today, why the bosses make the choices they make, and how they succeed, and the places where they fall short. Just in case you haven't been here before, I'm going to grade everything on an F through S scale. F means it is a failure as a boss fight and detracts from the game. D means it's not an interesting boss fight, but doesn't make me hate my life. C is an average fight. B is a great fight. A are the fights that you look forward to when you're replaying the game, and S are the fights that make the game as good as it is. They're the fights that stick in your head long after they're over. So without further ado, let's dive down into the bug-infested world of Hollow Knight. When replaying Hollow Knight, there is no better moment to describe the way that the player is empowered over the course of the game's duration than going from watching footage of an endgame battle to watching a player fight against the Gruz Mother. Because to say that she moves in slow motion compared to the endgame suggests far more speed than she actually boasts. The Gruz Mother rests right on that line between mini-boss and boss, with a simplistic moveset that works well enough for the early game but doesn't provide a suitable threat later on in the experience. After all, she even shows up later as a duo fight in a random wave in one of the Colosseum trials. The Gruz Mother is created as an early game boss to test your positioning and make sure that you're prepared to dodge at any point via 2 attacks. Either a charge forward, slamming against the wall, or a long series of slams, bouncing against the walls of the arena in a zigzag pattern. These attacks move fast enough that you have to make sure that you do have some distance between you and her to either walk out of the way or jump above the Gruz Mother's charge. It is amazing how much removing the player's mobility in this fight is felt in later playthroughs. Without the dash, the Gruz Mother punishes greed as she barrels towards you, but when you face her with an endgame moveset in Godhome, especially the shadow dash and the double jump, there is nothing she can do to the player. It makes it a strange fight to start a repeated playthrough with, because you'll often just not bother dodging because you expected yourself to be able to move faster, and then you'll get hit. Not to say that she's in any way a threat on a repeat playthrough, it takes no time at all to kill the Gruz Mother. Her health is far too low even for an introductory mini-boss, and it's easy to take her down in 10 to 15 seconds if you know what you're doing. On a more positive note though, the limited arena space here does some great double duty. The small area means that the Gruz Mother can never fly out of reach while still making her attacks all feel quicker than they are to a new player. The force that she runs into the wall does sell the player on the power of the charge, and the restrictive space is one of the big things that helps to sell that. On top of that, the multiple wall bounce attack has a great skill ceiling. A new player will often step back and let it happen, just needing to dodge under her once, but an experienced player can attack her while she's bouncing once you get to know how to control your movement. Again, the issue is that the fight goes by far too quickly once you know how to do this, which removes a lot of the impact of the Gruz Mother as a boss. The end of the fight does contain a fun falling action, with her chest bursting out as a swarm of Gruz fly out on the final notes of the boss's theme. At this point, the fight is effectively done, as the Gruz's slow patterns means they're never too much of a challenge, but it does end up being a dramatic ending that makes the encounter end on a more memorable note. Her ascended variation in Godhome also has enough of a change to deserve discussion. Not only does she gain a little bit more health, but 3 spike pits are added to the arena. Though it does mean the fight is more engaging, I think it also speaks to how straightforward the Gruz Mother is. The fight is so simple even compared to the rest of the early game that even with half the floor removed, she still struggles to be anything other than a speed bump. Overall, the Gruz Mother earns a high D grade. I was debating putting her in the C grade, but the fight is just a little too short, especially if you've already collected Vengeful Spirit by the time you find her, which is more than realistic. The False Knight is the first real boss encounter of the game. The Gruz Mother is fully optional, only locking Sly and Salubra behind her, but False Knight is a partially required battle in order to progress into Green Path. Unlike Gruz Mother, though he also feels like he moves in slow motion compared to the endgame, he feels a lot more complete and thorough as a boss fight than the Gruz Mother did. As a big circular knight with a mace, the False Knight primarily attacks by leaping around to deal damage with his body and a large jumping swing. On top of that, a well-telegraphed swing with his mace that creates a shockwave that players will need to leap over. Once you've dealt a certain amount of damage to the knight, he'll collapse over and you're introduced to the creature really piloting this suit, a tiny, goofy-sounding maggot that you slap a few times before he gets back up. Now this is completely personal, but the way I learned about Hollow Knight was actually a video compilation of every boss fight in the main game. It ended up auto-playing in the background, and Gruz Mother didn't look very impressive to me. When I watched the False Knight footage, however, and the maggot popped out of the suit for the first time, I immediately stopped the video and checked out the game on Steam the next day. This little guy is filled with so much character that to me it makes the fight entertaining even when the moveset is simple enough that veteran players don't see it as anything more than a road bump. There are also a lot of great environmental interactions with this fight. Certain attacks that the False Knight does cause rocks to fall from the sky, particularly an attack he uses when he rises up after a knockdown, where he'll leap into the center of the arena and jump around wildly. Not only does this effectively introduce the occasionally bullet hell-esque element that some later fights will really lean into, but the rocks also serve as a form of optional offense, as you can hit the rocks out of the sky and into the False Knight for additional damage. Since the False Knight is blocking players from access to their first spell, it means that players will often be limited to just their nail here. This does a great job keeping the fight dynamic, as obviously in melee the player will feel engaged, but now the player has an opportunity to feel engaged even when they're stepping away to give the boss some space. On top of that, the False Knight's unique use of the stagger mechanic works really well for teaching new players. When you stagger most bosses, you'll have a few moments before they'll gather themselves and leap back into the fight. Or you can alternatively break them out of that stun by attacking. False Knight will not stand back up until you've done enough damage to the maggot, which means a new player can stop and heal multiple times throughout the encounter without ever being in a rush. Even more so, you only gain soul to heal from hitting the maggot, which means there is a limit to how many times new players can heal. The False Knight may not be a ridiculous challenge, but it forces new players to engage in a really fun way. And with even more replayable detail packed in, the False Knight, as I slightly alluded to before, is not necessarily required. After you've gotten the first knockdown on the False Knight, this point in the wall weakens as he does his first wild slam attack, at which point you can destroy that wall and leave the arena. This not only gives returning players the flexibility they need to bypass a skill check boss that they won't have a problem with, but it also gives an observant first-time player struggling with the False Knight the ability to improve themselves with magic. It's a great mechanic. It also leads into the great final beats of the battle. Each wild slam shakes the arena more and more until, after his last knockdown, the floor gives way as he does his wild slam and he falls down, allowing the player to drop down and land the final blows. For a first major boss, this serves as a really satisfying moment, even if it may lack some of the challenge that later fights in this game try to reach. Also, the head of his mace is a bug the whole time, and that's adorable. The False Knight may be a simple foe, but there are so many details and environmental interactions that he remains a satisfying foe to overwhelm, even as the game grows so exponentially in complexity from him. He earns a low A grade, and also holds the honor of being the boss that attracted me to Hollow Knight in the first place, and I will always love him for that. Much like the Gruz Mother, the Vengefly King suffers from his simplicity. He has two moves. He roars to summon some Vengeflies to fill the area, or he sweeps across the floor as a hitbox. Sometimes he'll just roar and not summon anything, too. He's simple enough that, for his boss rematch in the Pantheon of Hollow Nest, there are just two of him. And even with that, he still ends up a contender for the easiest boss in the Pantheon. From a design standpoint, the Vengefly King does try to teach an important skill. The player doesn't have the mobility necessary to hit him at the point they'll encounter him, and though Vengeful Spirit can absolutely shred his limited health bar if you know how to do it, most new players are going to have to learn one of, if not the single most important mobility and combat skill that Hollow Knight utilizes: pogoing. and the Vengefly King focuses on teaching this pretty naturally. The Vengefly King can only be reliably damaged when he's flying across the arena, and the only way to dodge that at this point is by jumping. This means that a new player will be swinging downward in order to hit the Vengefly King, and when they do so, start to notice that they're bouncing off the boss. So though the boss himself is boring at the best of times, he does serve an important role in the game as a whole by serving as another opportunity for players to experiment with the mobility of their moveset. He's also attacking Zote when you find him, which means that he doesn't feel like a waste of time, especially since a knowledgeable player can walk in with a full soul meter and instantly blast him down without needing to engage with the fight at all. Overall, I'm going to give the Vengefly King another D grade. His role as a tutorial for players who haven't figured out pogoing gives him a lot of grace, because otherwise he'd likely be at the bottom of the pool. After all, if you make Gruz Mother look like more of a real threat, you've done something wrong. But speaking of the bottom of the pool, the massive Moss Charger doesn't really earn the same grace that Vengefly King did. Similarly, featuring two moves, the Charger will either rush at the player or jump over the player. The jump can be avoided by walking slightly to the side, maybe even getting a cheeky hit in, but the dash attack is honestly more dangerous for the Moss Charger than it is for the player. If you use charms like Quick Slash or Heavy Blow, this boss is just a quick time event. You hammer your attack button, and it dies. It is so bizarrely and uniquely disinteresting and underdeveloped as a challenge that it's become a meme within the community. I'm not ranking these encounters based off their ascended variations, but for some reason, the massive Moss Charger is the only of the simple trio of bosses that remains unchanged. The Gruz Mother gained spikes in her arena, the Vengefly King was doubled, but all the massive Moss Charger gets is more health, and especially that late in the game, that really doesn't matter. Most bizarrely, this is an empowered version of a really unique enemy. When you hit a normal Moss Charger, the Moss will break, and you'll gain the opportunity to attack the creature inside before it burrows away. I feel like there was a huge opportunity for a boss that you slowly disassemble or break down certain parts of before getting to his core to take him down. The massive Moss Charger is an F-grade encounter. Outside of memes, it serves no real role in the very tightly woven net that is Hollow Knight's world. And resting at the end of the early game, we reach the place where Hollow Knight really hits the ground running. The first battle with Hornet, guarding the dash upgrade that allows Hollow Knight's combat to really intensify. Compared to the enemies you fought up to this point, Hornet's speed has increased substantially, and her moveset is a lot more detailed than the other fights up to this point in the game. Hornet has a dash attack that she can start on the ground or in the middle of a jump, which gives her a lot of mobility and aggression, as she can interrupt her own movement in order to rush towards the player. Her ability to jump means she can maneuver and move away from the player, forcing them to consider their positioning more carefully than more telegraphed fights like the False Knight. On top of that, she also has an AoE that she can again perform grounded or airborne to punish any unchecked greed. And finally, she has a needle throw that needs to be dodged both leaving and approaching her, which is one of the most satisfying moves to learn, because you can leap over, land some hits, and leap back over the boomerang. It's ridiculously satisfying. This whole moveset comes together beautifully. Like the rest of the early bosses, her speed is eclipsed by the late game, but as the final challenge before the player gets the dash that the game balances around, she ends up testing the player's grasp of base mechanics before the game starts to add the increase in speed that the dash carries. Hornet also serves as the first major suggestion of the lore behind Hollow Knight. There is certainly suggestion of lore and story prior to the fight, but Hornet is the first moment that the game starts to really engage with any more standard storytelling tropes. Hornet starts to suggest something that you are that is wrong, something that you are seeking that she cannot let you find. It places you in the role of a now active participant in whatever story is happening rather than just a wanderer made of shadow. Even if the story itself will continue to elude understanding for a long while, Hornet Protector is where the game usually aims to sink its talons into the players. Hornet Protector earns another A grade. Again, she's much simpler than later fights, but successfully fulfills her role within the design of Hollow Nest really artfully. And once she drops, the player receives the dash, and the game's gloves come off. Though the False Knight and Hornet Protector hooked me into the game, the first moment of awe I experienced was the Mantis Lords. This is one of the most perfectly designed bosses in any action game, and it does so as a 2-on-1 battle. When the battle begins, a single Mantis Lord will drop down. It has 3 moves: a dash across the arena, a drop-down spear attack, and a few varieties of climbing on the wall and throwing its spears a boomerang that can be avoided. The first two attacks both have clear counters: leap over the dash and punish, potentially with a pogo if you can time it correctly, and step or dash to the side of the slam and then land a hit before she darts back away. The Mantis Lord disappearing leaves a few moments of downtime, but the fight moves fast enough that the player rarely feels like they're waiting on the game, and healing is a tall order here. Once the Mantis Lord is down, the other two Mantises stand up and attack together. This demonstrates why Hollow Knight has some of the single best multi-enemy boss fights I've ever had the pleasure of fighting. The Lords attack in this almost natural rhythm: dash, slam, slam, dash, dash, slam, dash, dash, and then a huge stopping moment as they'll both create new boomerang patterns. The only moments the player really gets to breathe are if they've learned the boomerangs well enough to find somewhere they can heal safely. This fight is a huge increase in challenge from any of the battles that came before, and though they aren't required to be fought at this point in the list, the game's world is beautifully built around them. Making the reward the Mark of Pride charm is a great way to encourage an early matchup for experienced players, and if the player dies at least once, they'll end up seeing Quirrell on their way back to the boss, informing them about a nailsmith in the City of Tears who will allow them to deal more damage. The precision of this boss also means that, as the game's difficulty starts to intensify, it does so in a fair and well communicated way. You never get killed by the Mantis Lords wondering what you're supposed to have done, because every move here is so precise and clear that it's only a matter of execution. And when you combine that with Quirrell, it makes it clear that leaving and upgrading is a potential strategy. The one minus with the fight is that it does have a little bit of negative space after the second of the Mantis Lords goes down. The teleportation speed of the Mantis doesn't increase, so the finale ends up feeling slower than the first Lord. However, I do think this still serves as a decent falling action. If you successfully made it through 2, then the third Lord won't have anything to surprise you anyway. The fight is just a matter of cleaning up at this point, and the rotating nature of the Mantis Lord's attacks means the fight won't ever go on for much longer. The Mantis Lords earn Hollow Knight's first S grade. They may be a minimalist fight with a limited moveset, but every move is used with such intent and precision that I cannot help but be impressed with how incredible this fight feels. The Soul Warrior is a boss only by technicality. Out of everything on this list, it's the only boss that appears twice in the overworld without a title card. It only earns a spot on this list due to its statue in Godhome. But with that said, the Soul Warrior is a difficult boss to analyze. After all, if we analyze it as a boss, it struggles to stand out from the rest of the more detailed roster. It teleports around the arena using slashes, downward slams, or casting spells. There is a rematch with this boss, which upgrades Vengeful Spirit, and in it, the health gets a decent increase and he starts to summon mobs, which adds a lot of needed complexity to the moveset. Now, these moves aren't bad, and the teleportation builds on the Soul Sanctum's primary enemies while keeping the fight exciting, but none of the moves feel unique to the Soul Warrior. There's nothing that makes him stand out past a basic enemy. But on the other hand, if we analyze Soul Warrior as a big mob blocking access to the Soul Master and Shade's soul with it, it shines a lot compared to just waves of enemies. The addition of melee attacks alongside the magic of the rest of the area makes the fight a lot more interactive and exciting than just gauntlets filled with teleporting mages would be. On top of that, the fact that he only ever teleports away to cast a spell that players can punish by staying aggressive keeps the fight from ever getting stale or stopping in the same way gauntlets would have. He also serves as a great nail upgrade check before you reach the more challenging fight at the peak of the Sanctum. Since the player can often only land one hit at a time, cutting so many hits off the length of the fight is immediately felt by a player. I think the Soul Warrior, despite his simplicity, does still edge into the C grade. He rides the line right between the D and C grade, but he's not an unpleasant fight, and he helps with the difficulty build-up of the Soul Sanctum. The second version definitely feels a little stranger, with the moveset simplicity struggling to last until endgame, but again, it's effectively a mini-boss challenge with the additional complication of mobs, and so it does decently well at that too. Hollow Knight as a game is very martial. Even among the more magical enemies the players face, most enemies will still attack you with their bodies, claw attacks, or other weapons. Soul Master is the first of a very small group of enemies who base their moves around magic more than melee, and it makes him stand out from the rest of the roster in a really great way. His introduction is the most cinematic thus far in the game, bursting from the background with this huge teleport before he begins his assault. He can teleport and shoot a tracking orb, which will often do 2 to 3 times in a row, forcing the player to chase him around in order to try to sneak in a few attacks. He can also appear at the side of the arena and create a rotating circle of orbs that the player has to travel through before he'll disappear and send the orbs back across with an increased speed. It is possible to land a hit here, but it demands a lot more aerial mobility and precision than any of the bosses that came prior, which make the Soul Master feel like a really hard boss to punish on a first playthrough. He also has 2 more melee-focused attacks. One is a simple dash across the ground. It moves slowly enough that your pogoing skills that you've ideally been honing since the Vengefly King are rewarded with a few hits, but the other attack is a lot more complicated. He'll teleport above the player with an audio cue and smash down into the ground. That is, of course, unless you dodged too quickly, in which case he'll start to smash down, but instead teleport again and dash down even faster there. It ends up creating an exciting dodge rhythm that means you're never more than a moment away from ever being hit, as you start to delay your dodge as long as possible. This is one of those genius design decisions that make a slower attack feel terrifying. It also builds up the reward from this fight, being his dive spell. It improves the gameplay, makes the atmosphere feel more tense, and encourages the player to later make use of a new move once they finally manage to win. On top of that, the Soul Master has a second phase escalation that is both effective and hilarious. Whenever the Soul Master staggers, he will completely deflate for a moment, and at the end of the first phase, deflate and start to teleport around wildly. He vanishes for a moment, and as you leap up to collect the upgrade that you've rightfully earned, he'll reappear and smash down at you, destroying the floor and trapping you in a new, lower portion of the arena. The second phase is a lot simpler than the first, and I still adore it. He only uses his smash down attack for a short time, forcing your timing to be even more precise as the speed is increased. It is possible to damage him here, but requires even more advanced knowledge of exactly where the slam hitboxes are. After he smashes the ground for a little while, he'll teleport to a random location on the bottom half of the arena and start to spawn magic orbs. Most players are going to use this part of the phase in order to land most of their attacks, weaving through the orbs as the master stays in a single spot for the longest time in the entire battle. Now, if you don't kill him in time, the cycle will repeat. He'll dive over and over again until he chooses a new spot to sit. Importantly, this phase teaches a skill that becomes absolutely critical in the boss fight against the Radiance, the game's final boss encounter. Namely, having to deal with spawning magical orbs while trying to attack a slightly moving around airborne creature. I love the Soul Master, and I think he executes his concept beautifully. He earns an A grade. His moveset is unique while still being clear and concise. He has a ton of fun characterization and feels like a great climax for the Soul Sanctum. The last of what I'd consider the simple early game bosses, the Crystal Guardian faces the knight after being nicely asked to make space on a bench that definitely had enough room for both of them. Like other simple bosses, the Crystal Guardian has 2 real attacks. It screams, spawning 4 lasers that cover the arena vertically, or charges a single laser targeted at the knight's location, forcing them to jump up and usually either dash over the Guardian or pogo on his head to stay out of the blast. Though both satisfying to dodge, especially the tracking laser, they don't create a lot of depth. The player just needs to stand next to the Guardian and press attack, jumping over him if he points a laser at you, or stepping to the side if a vertical laser happens to land on you, which it's also very possible that it just won't. He has one other thing worth noting. He'll occasionally leap around the arena, and his body, like almost everything in Hollow Knight, is a hitbox. The reason I mention it here is that the Guardian is incredibly talented in terms of jumping into the player. Now, this doesn't make the fight too difficult, but it is indicative of how simple the fight is that the Guardian jumping around randomly is often his hardest move to dodge. The Crystal Guardian only earns a D grade. Though the moves here have some potential, they don't combine together in any engaging way. And with how easy it is to just stand next to him and hammer at the attack button, the Guardian ends up lacking the depth necessary to stay entertaining. Oh, Flukemarm. Somehow, in my most recent challenge run, this was the only boss where, after just 2 attempts, I realized she was completely impossible to defeat. I mean, just look at this footage, it's absolutely ridiculous. Flukemarm has one attack, and even that statement is being generous. Every few seconds, she'll spit out 2 flukes, up to a maximum of 6 on screen at a time. The flukes will move faster than the player and can take anywhere between 3 to 1 hits to kill, depending on what your nail's upgrade level is. If you kill the flukes in a single hit, this fight is steamrolled, but if it takes more than 1 hit to kill the flukes, this becomes a ridiculously difficult encounter without magic. The fluke movement may be strange, but once you have it figured out, a properly equipped player is just going to slap the flukes away before going back to hitting the body, and the fight doesn't last much longer from there. As I mentioned, magic also does a ton of work against this boss. As soon as you use any spells, the Flukemarm is effectively a waste of space. Even without using charms to buff magic, just a few shriek spells was enough to burst through the fight before she had the opportunity to do anything. There is nothing fun about the Flukemarm. Whether you're being swarmed by 6 enemies attacking too fast to handle, or the boss is crumpling without any real effort on your part, the Flukemarm is an F-grade boss. And frankly, the worst boss in Hollow Knight. Damage test bosses work best to block off a portion of the game, but a damage test boss rewarding the player in a niche charm ends up a bizarre design choice in a game that usually places bosses in the world with a lot of intention. This may sound like a strange sentence, but Hollow Knight has some really good voice acting. Some of the lines from bosses and NPCs cement themselves into your mind, and despite being nonsense words and phrases, are incredibly characterizing. Even just hearing me play Hollow Knight meant my wife started using Bafanada in our day-to-day life. The voice acting is just that good. But there is one voice actor who goes above and beyond the rest. One voice actor who brings so much enthusiasm and energy that before a single text box comes up on screen, he created a fan-favorite character. Behold, Ogrim, the Dung Defender. The greatest strengths of Hollow Knight's best boss fights are often their atmosphere and characterization. The False Knight being a maggot piloting the armor, the Soul Master's wild screaming, and even Hornet's focused strikes. The Dung Eater here is having so much fun that it is beyond contagious. He is laughing and singing to himself as he leaps around the arena with these over-the-top battle cries, and when combined with the almost dance-like soundtrack, compared to the usually more intimidating boss themes, it gives the entire encounter a unique, fun feel. The malevolence and dread of the waterways is somehow nowhere to be found here, as the bizarre and heroic nature of this knight ends up on full display as he throws balls of his own shit at you. The moveset here doesn't disappoint either. He'll move through the floor of his arena like a swimming pool, throw balls of dung that bounce off the walls and floor, and even fling himself around the arena, laughing wildly as he bounces against the walls. A talented player can even chase underneath him and juggle him to stop him from ever leaving this state. He can also go underground and prepare to burst out, allowing the player to either use the dive spell to knock him out of the ground and get some free hits, or to make sure to position themselves to hit him as he dives up, or focus entirely on dodging the falling dung orbs from the upwards explosion. When his health gets low, he'll do a final attack barrage. He gives another huge battle cry and pounds his chest before performing this bursting attack 6 times in a row. Like most of the underground attacks, he can be knocked out of it by a dive, or the player can choose to take the reliable attacks as an opportunity to land a few more hits to get to the end sooner. Either way, it is a really exciting way to feel like you're progressing prior to the end of the fight. The one issue is that the Royal Waterways is a strange area in terms of when in a run you're supposed to be doing it. It can be reached really early on, or players can choose to hold off for a long time before diving into dark and often restrictive tunnels. Ogrim is balanced for that earlier version, which means it is very easy to run into the Dung Defender when you are massively overprepared and he poses absolutely no risk, which ends up turning into a real bummer. Overall, the Dung Defender earns a high A grade. If he was a little stronger and could take a few more hits, I think I'd give him that S grade title. But like the Abyss Watchers before him, that smaller health bar hurts him a lot when you're replaying the game. And speaking of bosses that feel like there isn't a natural place to fight them, we have the Brooding Mawlek. Located in the Forgotten Crossroads, the Brooding Mawlek can technically be reached as the game's first boss, but only through some very precise pogoing on wall spikes. Usually, players will come here after getting the Mantis Claw down in Fungal Canyon, and if players come here right after, the Mawlek does pose a decent risk, while also having a solid reward in the form of a Mask Shard. But if they keep exploring and progressing through the game, and don't come back for the Mawlek until later, the area outside the Mawlek evolving to the infected crossroads ends up more dangerous than the boss residing within it. The Brooding Mawlek has 4 attacks, but unlike a majority of Hollow Knight's bosses, Mawlek's attacks intentionally overlap with each other, forcing more situational awareness than a lot of the other fights. 2 of his attacks follow the more typical pattern of attacks in Hollow Knight. The first is that he'll spit a wall of infection that covers one half of the arena, forcing a player to leap up and either dash over or pogo on the Mawlek. Though it's straightforward, it's also a satisfying move to dodge, especially when it brings the usual rhythm of the fight to a temporary halt. His second attack is, like the Crystal Guardian, leaping around, but the Brooding Mawlek is a lot more predictable as to where he's going to move. The first jump will always take him off his center platform, and the second will always bring him back to the middle. It gives him some much needed mobility, as he's usually restricted to that middle platform, while still keeping the horizontal design of the Mawlek's attacks from ever becoming frustrating. In the Ascended version, the Mawlek is in a flat area, which theoretically makes him more mobile and thus more dangerous. Personally, I actually prefer the characterization that the arena added. The fact that the Mawlek is so central on the screen here while still being able to threaten the whole space is a lot more engaging than him just wandering around the flat arena. His last 2 attacks are where this moveset gets unique. If he's not doing one of his aforementioned attacks, the Mawlek is constantly spitting infection globs at a consistent pace, one at a time, with some light tracking towards the knight's location at the start of the spit. They aren't too tough to dodge, but they do make the already fairly limited space on one half of the Mawlek a lot more restrictive. And then this combines with the fact that, whenever the player gets close to the Mawlek, it'll do a quick claw strike that I've never seen anyone dodge the first time he does it. Once you know this attack is coming, it's easy to attack once or twice and then pull back. But this attack gets complicated by those constantly falling infection globs. You have to be aware of where you're going to run away to as you dodge those claw strikes and land your attacks. It ends up creating this fun back and forth while not being overwhelmingly demanding. The fight discourages mashing the attack button in a way a lot of other early game fights didn't, while not forcing the player to wait so long that the battle ever becomes boring. Like the Dung Defender, he suffers from his strange placement in the overworld. Because of that, especially combined with the lack of any wow factor, I think he just holds on to a C grade. I enjoy the fight and the unique way the attacks intertwine, but it lacks any purpose within the game's world. Outside of the Dung Defender, I haven't really brought up music. Most of the early songs are good, and the Dung Defender's is particularly characterizing. But the first point in the game that a boss theme really lingered in my head after the fight was done was the Broken Vessel. This boss guards the Monarch Wings and feels like it marks about the middle of the game proper, which is saying a lot considering we are only 13 bosses into a 47 boss long list. There's a melancholic feeling that the Broken Vessel brings to the table that other boss fights haven't tried to create. All at once exciting, intense, and uncomfortable, this vessel and his cello-focused lament echoes the main theme of the game and does a ton of work setting up the emotional roller coaster that the final battle of the game plans to take you on. From a moveset and design standpoint, the Broken Vessel is a dark reflection of the player. A vessel, like you, but broken at the bottom of the basin, and at the bottom of the world filled with infection and rot. This is a walking corpse, and the moveset amplifies the knights in a great way. The vessel will flail with his nail, or do a dash along the ground or in the air, being able to be pogoed off of, or being able to be bounced even further into the air. He also similarly has a dive attack, creating a few orbs of infection as well that need to be dodged. The Broken Vessel leaps back and forth incredibly quickly, often being difficult to dodge as he'll leap into the player, especially as he frequently stops mid-leap in order to do an attack or charge. On top of the rest of his moveset, the Broken Vessel also has a Bullet Hell attack, where he'll begin to flail in the center of the arena, causing orbs of infection to leave him, go down, and rise up through the arena. I really love the nature of the projectiles rising up towards the player. Often, projectiles in this game come from above or to the side, but down in the basin where it seems like the player is at the bottom of all things, there is still something underneath rising up towards you. And that ends up being the case, because below the basin is the abyss, the source of both you and this unfortunate vessel. Now that might be an over-analysis of a bullet hell attack, but the variation in how projectiles works makes the vessel seem unique compared to a lot of the other battles and similar bullet hell attacks. After he's taken a few hits, the broken vessel will begin to spawn infection balloons. These always have 1 hit point, dying in 1 hit, and will move at a predictable pace towards the player in a straight line. I love these things as mobs. Other summoned enemies like the Flukes were difficult due to the arena's unique shape and the Fluke's propensity to get stuck on something before they burst at the player with speed. And enemies in the Soul Warriors later rematch are more of a threat from having any additional health. But the balloons here only have 1 hit point and are very predictable. Any nail hit, spell, or even charm damage can break them instantly, which turns the entire fight into more of a balancing act. The broken vessel is a glass cannon. His attacks move quickly and he can be targeted down very fast if you hit him from stagger to stagger. With the addition of the balloons, the player needs to be more aware of their surroundings, taking the gaps in the vessel's aggression to pop the balloon before returning to the boss. And with more balloons, there's never a want for soul, so using spells to get out of tight situations, or just to add more damage, becomes a key to the damage race that this fight has the potential to become. I'll get more into how the broken vessel plays into the story as a whole as we get to the Hollow Knight, but this fight introduces the thematic concepts that the game plans to bring to its climax in a much calmer environment, offering an excellent battle against a dark version of the main player's avatar, while using Christopher Larkin's absolutely incredible main theme to an astonishing effect. Personally, I think the broken vessel rests near the top of the A grade. If he had a little more endurance, I think he'd be higher again, but like the Dung Defender, he just goes down too quickly. Ah, if only there were a more difficult version. But with all of the movement upgrades accessed in this hypothetical boss order, it's time to collect the Dream Nail, the item that provides the player their first sense of precise direction. Find 3 dreamers and use this nail on them. On top of that, the Dream Nail provides immediate access to 3 matches that I'll get to later, and a group of 7 bosses that I'll get into now. The Dream Warriors, the first of whom is found right next to the Dream Nail's location, Xero. The Dream Warrior visual designs were all made by Kickstarter backers, and so they end up a bit more hit and miss for me than the rest of the game's design. Though a lot of these designs are neat, some will carry a lot more characterization than other more straightforward ones. Xero's design is pretty good. It fits him well, and it gives a feeling of power with the silhouette almost looking like he has a cape that flows behind him. Each Dream Warrior has one attack that, after reaching a certain amount of health, speeds up. Xero has 2 floating spears. One of them will spin and then rush towards the player before slowly moving back towards its place. Once he gets low on health, he'll summon 2 more spears and start being able to have 2 spears fly out at a time. Though it's simple design, the boomerang nature of the attack means that positioning stays fun, while also never trapping the player in a bad situation off of bad luck alone. He introduces the concept behind Dream Warriors really well, because the player immediately understands how these fights will end up working. His Ascended Arena is also a solid upgrade, as the single floor gives way to 3 platforms. With so much of the fight being about positioning yourself to hit Xero while avoiding being between him and his spears, this kind of arena complicates a simple battle in a great way. Though it doesn't make him impossible, it means that there's a lot more to make Xero interesting than there was for battles like Gruz Mother and the Vengefly King. Overall, I'd give Xero a C grade. He's an interesting opponent while still being simple enough that players can build up some essence on these easier bosses, and his placement right next to the Dream Nail means that he's also a great way to tell players what to look for, how to find these battles in the overworld, and what to expect from each of them. As I mentioned, all the Dream Warriors were designed by a Kickstarter backer, and whoever designed Gorb deserves a solid handshake and award, because this guy is just so much goddamn fun. The actor here is going absolutely wild as a slug floating around, creating spiral waves of spears that emerge and shoot with a delay. As the fight progresses, Gorb starts to add eventually 2 more waves, each offset so that the first and third waves will hit the same location and the second hits directly between them. Strangely enough, this is a really good attack to learn how to dodge, as it shows up again in the fight against the Radiance with the Sunbeams. The fact that Gorb is knocked back when you hit him means using spells to reposition position him before the attack comes out is a really engaging interaction that players can use in a tricky situation. With a satisfying move to dodge that teaches skills that help in the true final boss of the game, and an incredible characterization as Gorb instructs the player to ascend with Gorb, Gorb also plays with the exciting trope of getting the player to return back to the opening area of the game now that they've collected movement upgrades. Gorb appears on your map with the Dream Warrior pin, introducing people to an area they might not otherwise notice, and as they explore, they'll have the best chance to run into the Grimm Troop Lantern. Having a boss that marks on your map later in the game is a great way to get players to return back to the start, and Gorb makes that happen. Like Xero before him, Gorb's Ascended Arena decides to lose the floor. It sadly doesn't improve Gorb as much, since horizontal mobility is less important here than vertical mobility, but it doesn't hurt the fight to have a little bit more of a threat, as he is one of the two more straightforward Dream Warriors. Gorb shall earn a B grade, and is my favorite Dream Warrior to fight. Elder Hu is the dreamer found within the fungal wastes, and though I love the concept of these purple beads sticking out against the yellow, he always felt a little off compared to the other dreamers. Even when the dreamers are louder like Gorb and later Marmu, there is still an almost uncanny nature to the battles, a silence of other sounds outside of the Dream Warrior that kicks in as soon as the dream itself wakes up. Elder Hu is the exception because the entire fight is filled with the sound of hammers smashing into the ground, which robs the fight of a lot of its potential atmosphere. Elder Hu is one of the only dreamers with two wholly unique attacks as he floats around. The first has him raise his hand and bring down a random pattern of hammers that cover about half the arena. They drop down quickly, but I've never found myself in any fully impossible situation. I'm not sure exactly how the randomness safeguard works, but there seems like there has to be a gap at least nearby your current location. As he does this, you can also jump up and land some cheeky hits. His other attack is where the fight completely loses me though. Elder Hu teleports away and creates a cascade of hammers that begin on the outside and fall one at a time towards the middle of the arena. If the player doesn't have the Shade Cloak, there is a little bit of timing involved, but if they do, then the attack is a non-threat. More frustratingly, it is an attack that lasts for about 4 seconds and can only be interacted with via a single dodge. Elder Hu is completely gone, so there's nothing to attack, there's no skill ceiling here, there's just dodge once. It provides a window to heal, yes, but the Dream Warrior fights are usually shorter than most normal boss fights and are not built around having windows to heal, so this ends up feeling more like dead time than anything else. When that's combined with the fact that Elder Hu has a chance to teleport whenever he gets hit, the fight pretty easily starts to drag on as you spend most of it chasing after the Elder while dodging pretty boring attacks that don't carry any of the atmosphere that the already straightforward fights boasted. On top of that, Elder Hu is one of only 2 Dream Warriors that do not increase their tempo over the course of their battle, meaning that feeling of progression that the Dream Warriors usually excel at is missing. I think Elder Hu is the worst Dream Warrior with a D grade. It's alright for fights to take a while or for bosses to be evasive, but Elder Hu goes a little bit too far with it. This one might seem like a little bit of whiplash after I was so upset about Elder Hu's habit to teleport away, but I really like the encounter with No Eyes. No Eyes has no attacks herself. She'll float around her arena singing, and you have to chase after her in the hopes of being able to hit her once or twice before she teleports elsewhere. Unlike Elder Hu, however, who felt like he was dragging out a fight by disappearing for almost a third of the encounter, No Eyes leans into the concept of chasing her down by doubling down on her atmosphere. Her arena is dark, lit only by the lantern upgrade, and the Dream Warrior music doesn't play here. All you hear is No Eyes singing, uncanny and off-pitch just enough to feel haunted while still feeling musical. The threat in the arena comes from floating ghosts that fly through the entire space, bobbing up and down as they do. At first, there's only a few on screen at a time, but the lower No Eyes gets, the faster the ghosts get and the more they spawn, until they end up covering a ton of screen real estate. There's no summoning animation or a moment it speeds up either. Things just naturally intensify over the course of the battle as the tension here builds and builds. I haven't really touched on it yet, but Hollow Knight elects not to have health bars for its boss fights, so you never know how far you were towards victory until the moment the boss finally drops. In fights like this that draw tension out further and further, it means that there's never a moment of real pause until the moment the boss dies, which makes the atmosphere feel even more exceptional. I also really love the visual design of No Eyes. The dripping black from her eyes, the hair going wild throughout the fight, it makes an uninterested boss feel incredibly present. moment. Personally, I think No Eyes earns a high B grade. Gorb may be my favorite Dream Warrior, but No Eyes is a fight that, from a design standpoint, technically has the most going for it. Most of the Dream Warriors that the player finds are found as gravestones, with only 2 exceptions. My personal favorite of those exceptions being the grave site of Galien. In the deepest corners of Deep Nest, surrounded by lifeblood and blue flowers, the corpse of this warrior awaits by his scythe, his soul trapped in an unwinnable battle against the hordes of the Weavers. When the fight begins, Galien draws what is by far my favorite weapon the Dream Warriors use, an old scythe drawn out of the ground. He spins it, and it begins to fly towards the player, bouncing off the ground and walls. It does track the player decently, but doesn't ever turn around until it's bounced off something, which keeps the attack feeling threatening without ever feeling cheap, something tracking attacks can easily drift into. As the fight progresses, Galien will start to spawn golden discs that don't track the player, instead moving in an almost DVD logo-like pattern around the arena. When this combines with the way that the scythe follows the player, it ends up adding some really fun danger without the ability to trap the player into damage unless the player put themselves somewhere that these 2 attacks were going to converge. Like the other Dream Warriors, Galien is a simple and sadly brief battle, but I really adore the encounter and think it also deserves a B grade. The atmosphere of this corpse in a blue-lit arena at the heart of the game's most oppressive space, the way his own weapon is ripped up out of the ground and flung towards you, and how the attack is so exciting to dodge as you can juke the scythe, throw it off your scent for a moment to create yourself a huge window to attack, it all comes together really well. Set in the Queen's Gardens, Marmu is usually one of the last Dream Warriors that people will encounter, but has the simplest concept out of the batch. Marmu will form into a ball and rush at the player. Hit him away enough and he'll teleport, pause, then roll into a ball and do it again. This entire fight is about timing. Marmu is a funny sounding yo-yo that you have to learn how to use. Once you do, the fight is pretty straightforward, especially when you combine it with charms that can extend your nail range and speed to make the rhythm easier to fall into. The issue here is that Marmu's bouncing physics are, to put it mildly, chaotically unpredictable. Sometimes he'll bounce exactly as you expect, but other times he'll start moving around at strange angles or go past the player at a weirdly high speed before turning and hitting them from behind, which can become really frustrating because it adds an X factor that feels more cheap than it does satisfying. On top of that, there's just nothing happening in this fight. If it works as intended, the fight isn't exciting because you're hitting Marmu as he bounces back and forth in a very predictable rhythm. But if it doesn't work as intended, it's frustrating as his physics will cause him to bounce and hit you from angles and speeds it feels like he shouldn't have access to. The one thing that saves him from the F grade is his charm. Marmu is effectively a dead pet dog, and he is adorable, even with that silly design. Combined with the constant screaming of his own name, Marmu makes for a really cute opponent, and hearing him whoop every time he gets hit does get pretty satisfying if the physics are working correctly. Personally, I think Marmu is another D-grade boss, coming in a little bit better than Elder, but definitely still a below average encounter. So this boss is not supposed to be here on the list. You cannot reach Markoth if you've only fought the bosses I've listed thus far, but I wanted to talk about all the Dream Warriors at once, and I didn't want to hold off on any of the other encounters for any longer than I already did, so here he is. The subject of so many Hollow Knight players' hatred, Markoth. Firstly, Markoth is almost certainly designed to be a late-game enemy. He is one of only 3 bosses outside of Godhome that requires you have Shade Dash. The only bosses that require that are him, Traitor Lord, and the Radiance. Like Galien, Markoth's corpse is found at the outskirts of Kingdom's Edge, and finding the corpse tucked away at the edge of the kingdom, though not as effective as Galien, does still create an atmospheric moment. Out of the 7 Kickstarter designs, I think Markoth is the strongest. Except Gorb, but Gorb is Gorb, and it isn't fair to compare him to anything else. The horned moth in a massive cloak cuts an imposing figure, and before you even see his moveset, he feels more powerful than the other Dream Warriors that you've encountered up to this point. In terms of gameplay, Markoth follows the example of the Brooding Mawlek, using 2 methods of offense that the player needs to get through at once in order to attack. Unlike the Mawlek, neither of these attacks trigger by the player getting close enough. Markoth's attacks are both non-stop. First, he'll spawn spears that rush at the player. Unlike Xero, these don't return to Markoth. But unlike Xero, they can spawn literally anywhere, next to the player on the other side of the arena. Outside the arena, off screen, they will appear and rush at you in a non-stop rhythm. On top of that, Markoth has a dream shield that circles around him as he flies randomly through the arena. His entire body is a hitbox, and he really loves to fly into the player. He is knocked back by nail strikes, but the dream shield will block attacks, which means the player really needs to choose their moments carefully. Markoth is also the only Dream Guardian who has a separate attack that is designed as a good moment for the player to heal or to be aggressive. He'll stop in place, stop summoning nails, and begin to spin the Dream Shield, increasing the radius of his threatened range. If you're far enough out, you can heal here. Otherwise, there is no time to recover. If you're aggressive enough, you can also push through and land a few hits or a spell on him. But then the second phase rolls along, and this is where the fight gets brutal. Not only does the speed of nails double, but Markoth starts to move faster and spawns a second Dream Shield that always stays exactly 180 degrees across from the first, which means the windows to attack here are even harder to find, and are honestly harder to find than they are for any boss in the entire game, and I mean that sincerely. Even among the elite final bosses, there are plenty of opportunities to attack, especially compared to Markoth's second phase. But all of that is not why Markoth is hated. The reason why he's hated so much is his Ascended Arena. In the original Markoth fight, there were moments that you could be trapped into taking damage, even with a full floor to explore below platforms that you were able to use verticality to your advantage. In the Ascended Arena, however, they got rid of the floor. You're fighting him now on 6 small floating platforms. And remember, you have a different nail coming at you from completely random, unpredictable directions, less than a second apart, combined with a randomly moving boss that can only be attacked from constantly changing angles. When Markoth works as he was intended to, the precision in the fight is great. Learning how to sneak through the barrage of nails and land a few hits, or when to abuse magic, being able to pogo off the Dream Shield to get out of a tricky situation, or using wall clings and invincibility dash, all feel great. And his low health scaling on your nail upgrade means that the fight won't ever last forever, regardless of how upgraded you are. But when Markoth is being rude, when those nails come from off screen while he's floating into you and trapping you into damage, or knocking you into a pit, it becomes one of the single most aggravating fights in the game. The detail in this fight and the challenge it poses are great in theory, and with some guardrails that stop the boss from ever trapping you in situations where you have to be hit, like how the False Knight wouldn't slam the mace on a new player if there wasn't enough space for that player to move back away from the knight, could have really helped remove some of the frustrations from this fight. Overall, I do think Markoth still earns a C grade. Yes, he can be frustrating, but having the final Dream Warrior be so precise isn't an inherent bad thing, and the challenge of the spinning Dream Shield and flying nails can make the fight satisfying to pull off. He's just held back by the frustrating moments, and if we were also grading Ascended Arenas, that one would definitely earn a worse grade. Despite being such a key point of the lore, there are not many beings made of void in Hollow Knight. The Knight is void, the Broken Vessel was probably void at one point, and the Hollow Knight himself is void. Outside of that, there's only one other Voidborn. And whereas Broken Vessel and Hollow Knight are both these solemn duels, the Collector is a chaotic, loud, and uncomfortable fight in the best way. The Collector is another of the most vocal bosses in Hollow Knight, spending most of the fight laughing, whooping, and even in his death, laughing maniacally as he collapses into a pool of goo. I've seen 2 camps online here. People who either find the Collector hilarious or violently uncanny. I personally land in the latter, especially with how the final blow is a drawn-out process of hitting the Collector as he melts away. Combined with the warped version of the base boss music, it makes for a really creepy encounter. The Collector joins Flukemarm in terms of combat strategy, but does so infinitely better. He's usually not too threatening of a boss, and he focuses on summoning enemies to attack. In terms of his actual attacks, he does 2 things. First, he hops around the arena in a very predictable series of arcs, before giving a whoop and lunging forward with a claw swipe. After a few moments, he can also leap into the ceiling, bringing jars down and releasing the enemies from within. At first, only 1 or 2 jars will land, but once you reach a certain health gate, he'll start dropping 2 or 3 jars instead. There are 3 unique enemy types, and they are not created equal. They can spawn a Vengefly Vengefly, which drops in a single hit after just one nail upgrade. He can summon a Balder, which provides a great horizontal threat and combines with the Collector's short hops to be a really lethal move. And then, of course, the Aspids, who spit a single blob at you while they fly around. Having random enemies does make this fight RNG dependent, but the enemies all interact in a fun way. Aspids are a constant issue, harrying the player with projectiles, but will also be flying away from the player, meaning the player has to make the active choice to chase them down. Vengeflies and Balders always move towards the player on the other side, either on the ground or in the air, meaning all three enemies end up providing a unique threat from the other ones. And with an upgraded nail, you can often catch enemies as they fall to keep the arena from getting out of control. But with that, like with Markoth, we do have to talk about Ascended Collector. He gets more health, yes, and the Balders become larger and tankier while the Vengeflies become stingers, rushing forward in a much more direct fashion. But the real threat, the real challenge here is that this is the only boss fight with Primal Aspids. For the uninitiated, the Primal Aspid flies away from the player and shoots 3 orbs at a time at a rapid pace. Standard Collector was already a fast-paced, uncanny fight that can quickly get out of control, but Ascended Collector is a terrifying monster, and if you aren't using the Unbreakable Strength charm with a fully upgraded nail, you can't kill his summons in a single hit. It is easily the most demanding Ascended increase, even with Markoth losing his entire floor. But with the Primal Aspid's existence mentioned, there is a final piece of design that makes the Collector come together. Hitting the Collector does not provide the player any soul, which means the only way to heal or to use magic is to hit his summons in melee. Considering how much Vengeful Spirit can defang this fight with its large hitbox, this forces the player to be more cognizant of their soul usage as they swap between attacks with the nail and using magic for burst damage. Unlike Flukemarm, being short on damage doesn't make the fight impossible, just far more challenging. I think the Collector earns a high B grade. Though the moveset is simple, the swarms of enemies make this fight thematic and unique while still staying fair and fun throughout. Hollow Knight doesn't have many required boss fights. Assuming that you don't use any skips at all, you'll need Hornet for dash, Dung Defender for the Eastmas tier, Broken Vessel for the double jump, Uumuu, the Watcher Knights, and the Hollow Knight. And of that grouping, the Watcher Knights often eclipse the challenge of even the final boss. This is easily the hardest of the required 6 fights. Like the Mantis Lords, the Watcher Knights are designed as a duo battle, but it also serves as a bit of an endurance test as you'll fight your way through the parade of knights. In my Dark Souls ranking, one of the more contentious bosses was the 4 Kings, a damage test that would spawn in additional kings as time passes. Watcher Knight takes that concept and polishes it into a fight that, though it's one of the game's most difficult, rewards game knowledge, skill, and exploration, all in incredible ways. At the start of the fight, one of the 6 Watcher Knights will wake up. After a short time, a second knight will rise to join him. Once one of these 2 knights drops, another knight immediately starts waking up, and that method of spawning continues until you're left in a one-on-one fight with the last knight, at which point you finally take it out and claim victory. There are so many things that this fight does well, so to start, let's talk about communicating to the player how much longer the fight is going to be. You can see all 6 of the knights at the start. Even amid the sea of knights in the background, it is immediately clear which knights are going to be animating as this fight continues, which gives the player a general idea as to how much time is left in the overall fight. On top of that, an observant player can knock down this chandelier, destroying one of the knights before the fight even begins, which is a great reward for exploration. Second, the pacing of the fight is perfect for a damage test. If you target only the first Watcher Knight before the second wakes up, you'll end up with 2 knights at near full health as the third wakes up. Unlike other endurance and damage test bosses like the 4 Kings and Bell Gargoyles, you're encouraged to spread your damage out among the knights throughout the battle. That way, once you're down to the final one-on-one, it won't last too long. Third, the Watcher Knight's moveset, though less precise than the Mantis Lords, is in my mind a nearly perfect duo moveset. 2 sword strikes can come out fast, but only cover a little space, meaning it's hard for this move to ever overlap with the other knight's more dangerous spinning moves. It discourages spamming attacks on the knight, but isn't going to add additional pressure if you were already retreating. Past that, there are 2 rolls, a straight roll that rolls across the arena and bounces off the wall, or a double bounce that varies arcs and usually leans towards higher jumps. While the Watcher Knights are in a rolled up form, they are immune to all nail strikes, but vulnerable to magic damage. This means using the dive to gain invincibility while still dealing some damage, or being able to get behind them in order to launch a Shade Soul to deal some spread out damage, or even finding a perfect pocket in an arc for an Abyss Shriek means every part of your arsenal helps in some unique way, which really rewards game knowledge by making the entire fight have a ton of opportunities to counterattack in what initially seems like a hard wall. On top of that, as the big gameplay challenge stopping players from finishing the game's best hidden upgrade, the Shadow Dash, ends up being a huge boon here. The Watcher Knights won't ever trap the player in attacks that are fully impossible to dodge. Being limited to only 2 at a time and having their attacks either leave a large vertical safe space or varying horizontal safe space means you'll rarely get hit from RNG. It is, however, very easy to make a mistake, to use a double jump when you shouldn't have. This is where the Shadow Dash lets you use your invincibility to escape bad situations. The game's design keeps it from being required while still heavily encouraging players to explore the rest of the game and lead towards that true ending. The only issue with the fight is that sometimes the Watcher Knight's rolls will just go in the wrong direction, causing you to roll away from you and into other walls, which often forces you into more challenging situations where the Watcher Knights are now on either side of you rather than being on one. Now, it's not as frustrating as moveset glitches like Ornstein's Charge, but it does hurt the fight a lot. On top of that, the Watcher Knights are often a frustrating battle to struggle against. Once you master their moveset and weave in and out of their attacks, it becomes satisfying. But when you're trying to find the gaps or learn about the weakness to magic, it doesn't create that same flow state that the rhythmic dashing of other duo fights like the Mantis Lords had while you learned it. The Watcher Knights are brutal and learnable, but the learning curve here can be very frustrating. Overall, I think the Watcher Knights deserve a high A grade. I know that might be a bit controversial since I know some people really loathe this fight, and I was in that camp as I learned the game my first playthrough, but the more I played, the more respect I gained for this design. Even in my recent no-nail upgrades, no magic, no healing, no charms run, I was able to get it on just my 6th attempt because there is a really specific precision here. I mentioned before that Watcher Knights is usually the last gameplay challenge that most players will encounter doing as few bosses as possible. The other option for the final boss before the Hollow Knight is the Guardian of Manamon the Dreamer, Uumuu. Now, I messed up and didn't record my winning 2nd attempt against Uumuu, and Uumuu is the only boss who I'll list their Godhome rematch as a completely unique battle, so there will not be any good footage here, just me trying to relearn Uumuu's attacks as I run out of health and die. Uumuu is cinematic in a way no other boss in Hollow Knight tries to be. The jellyfish cannot be damaged. Nails, spells, bizarre charms, you cannot touch Uumuu. It floats around the arena as a living hitbox and does 2 attacks on a loop. The first one generates lightning bugs with only a few safe gaps to stand, where you have to reach a safe spot and then stay there. The second generates lightning bugs on the player's location continuously for a few seconds, forcing the player to keep mobile. The 2 attacks work well together, but there isn't enough happening to make the waiting interesting. The attacks both have huge gaps between them, and once you remember the tells, they aren't that complicated. After a few attacks have come out, Quirrell shows up and attacks, making Uumuu vulnerable, and writing that sentence I realized I should probably explain who Quirrell is. Outside of Elderbug, Quirrell is one of the easiest NPCs for the player to bump into. He's inside the Black Egg Temple at the start of the game, he pushes you towards the City of Tears if you were struggling with the Mantis Lords, and he has a ton of other moments that his path crosses with the player. He's a wanderer, after all, like yourself, who's forgotten who he is, and his search has led him here, where he's realized he serves as a part of the key to access Manamon's dream to break the seal to the Hollow Knight. That's a real wiki-level summation, but the point is that Quirrell is a well-established character who's been unlocking memories that led him here. After he arrives the first time, deflating Uumuu for a few moments and making him vulnerable, Uumuu recovers and still keeps his focus on the player. Quirrell will continue to hop around, preparing to do another disrupting slash that gives you another moment to attack the boss. Usually, if you're properly leveled, this fight doesn't last too long, often ending anywhere between 1 to 3 cycles. The issue is that the fight here is a waiting game at the best of times. Uumuu does have a neat design and his attacks aren't bad, they engage together well, but running in a circle around the arena while you're waiting for Quirrell to attack doesn't make for an exciting battle. It is satisfying to work alongside an NPC, especially one as wholesome as Quirrell, but that doesn't make the battle last on subsequent playthroughs. I think Uumuu earns a D grade. There's some interesting stuff happening here, but the fight doesn't engage the player enough to make it a good fight to return to. And like I said, we'll get to Godhome Uumuu when we reach the DLC bosses. For most of Hollow Knight, bosses are designed around gameplay first with atmosphere as a close second. There is, however, an undeniable exception to this rule. One boss who is here to look cool and be creepy, whose entire moveset feels limited by the restrictions that the art design had. The player will first spot Nosk as they're walking through the edge of Deep Nest, and it'll look like another version of the knight, standing just ahead of the player. The player moves forward and Nosk leads them further and further down into the nest. Eventually, as the player heads through a tight tunnel, doors start to spring up behind them, and they walk into the arena to witness this. Once Nosk has torn out from his disguise and the horror movie music starts blasting full force, the player gets to fight the boss proper, and it's okay. The atmosphere remains excellent, with most of the credit here going to Larkin's soundtrack. This is one of my favorite boss themes. Deep Nest as an area didn't have a culminating boss fight at the Dreamer, which means Nosk ends up feeling like the optional culmination of the area's horror-adjacent atmosphere. As I mentioned before, his moveset is where things often struggle to impress, and this is his expanded moveset you're looking at. When he was released, he had two moves. He'd run across the arena, or he'd jump once. If you stood here, Nosk could never hurt you, and even with the expanded moveset, most of his attacks still can't hurt you here. But now there is one thing that can hurt you. In that aforementioned update, two more attacks were added to the encounter. The first has Nosk stop his charge in the center of the arena and spray infection everywhere, and the second only triggers if Nosk is under a certain health threshold. He'll leap into the ceiling and move towards you well off screen. Infection globs fall from the ceiling and stay as hazards for a moment, and eventually Nosk drops back down. And though these attacks are definitely more engaging, Nosk struggles from a strange to describe principle. Even among enemies with stranger attack patterns or patterns that make it more difficult to find a moment to attack, the bosses in Hollow Knight feel like they are designed to be fought. Things like the Watcher Knights left plenty of opportunities, and even bosses that spent most of their fight running away, like No Eyes, sacrificed mobility and up-close threat in order to make them into a more enjoyable encounter. Nosk charges and leaps around the arena quickly, which makes it feel constantly aggressive and is great for its atmosphere. But on the other hand, Nosk runs so far away so quickly and spends so much time on the ceiling that once that move unlocks, Nosk often feels like he's just running far enough away from you can't reach him, and outside of shooting a spell at him, you might as well just wait, because he's gonna come back in just a couple of seconds anyway. Though a strange contradiction within the fight itself, I think it still earns a B grade. The fight isn't as bad as it was on release, where it would have probably earned a bit of a lower grade, but it also doesn't lend itself to the same flow state most of the combat in Hollow Knight reaches. On the other hand, the atmosphere within this fight is beyond pitch perfect, easily resting above most of the other roster. Because of that, a little above average felt like a good place to put the encounter as a whole. At the end of the fight with the Crystal Guardian, way back at the start of this video, he fell down, got up, and leapt away. Once you get the Monarch wings and you're able to finally give chase, you run into him again, but this time, he's very cross with you. So cross, in fact, that he decides to be the first boss in the game that deals 2 damage every time he hits you. The Pure Vessel, 2 gods, and this very angry rock are the only ones that do 2 damage with every single hit. One of these things, to put it lightly, is not like the others. And yes, there are other bosses with moves that deal 2 masks of damage, but only these 4 deal 2 damage with every single part of their hitbox. With that being said, the Enraged Guardian's moveset has not changed from the Crystal Guardian, though it's almost doubled in speed. In some ways, this does make the fight harder. Attacks come out faster, and you need to be constantly ready to deal with both of his jumps and the lasers he'll conjure up. And the lack of a moment to heal and dealing 2 masks of damage means mistakes add up really fast, especially since it is possible you won't even be fully upgraded by the time you reach this rematch. On the other hand, learning this fight is one of the reasons that the Crystal Guardian becomes as hard to dodge as it is. Once the Crystal Guardian starts an attack, you have time to land a few more hits before you need to dodge, and the Enraged Guardian forces you to unlearn that habit. The moveset is still simple, but landing a hitless fight here is a lot more satisfying and rewarding, as by the time you finish dodging and punishing any move, another one is already starting to come out. The Enraged Guardian may feel like a joke in Godhome, especially compared to the other late game heavy hitters, but he is guarding a mask shard, meaning the player won't have the maximum amount of health, and the rematch will often happen as they're traveling to collect the pale ore for a nail upgrade from the top of the crystal peak. This means he's meant to be fought with your nail at either a +2 or a +3 with none of your health maxed. For a mid-game hurdle that you face before encountering the real horrors that await you in the late game, the increased pace and threat actually fit pretty well at this point in the roster. Blowing far past the first encounter, the Enraged Guardian gets a high B grade. I'll never forget the first time I realized he was dealing 2 masks of damage to me on every single hit. It easily was one of my highlights of the first playthrough, and helped make a simple boss feel a great role by setting that up as a rule that can be broken. Before we reach the end game, we have to talk about two of the strangest boss fights to analyze. Like in the From Software series, I haven't been discussing boss runs, but there are two boss fights that I have to break that pattern for. Because in order to face the Oblobble and God Tamer in the overworld, you have to get through the Colosseum. At the end of the second Colosseum challenge, the players will encounter the Oblobbles. Now before I even touch on the design of the Oblobbles, the second Colosseum challenge requires that the player get through 16 waves of enemies, a total of 63 mobs, before they face Oblobbles for the first time. And if the player dies at any point, both during this boss or the run, they have to do the whole thing again. There are no checkpoints. On top of that, the Oblobbles are one of the most abnormal bosses in the game. Instead of occasional attacks with bullet hell inspired elements, the Oblobbles are a bullet hell encounter, no ifs, ands, or buts. When there are two of them floating around, they'll bounce off each other and the walls before they occasionally stop to spray an array of infection orbs in every direction around them. The orbs do move decently fast, and don't follow the same predictable pattern as projectiles like Gorb. There are patterns that you can find, but they're similar enough that I personally can't tell them apart. Making it even more difficult, the Oblobbles' AIs are separate here. Sometimes the bullet hells line up, giving you a nice opportunity to counterattack, and other times they'll stagger, meaning you're dodging one bullet hell while trying to punish the other Oblobble. On top of that, Oblobble physics are some of the weirdest in the game, namely because it's possible to hit them in such a way that the Oblobble will start doing a stationary bullet hell while moving, and when they can bounce off each other at strange angles and speeds that make running into a player a real threat, combined with how much they're moving around and how many bullets are on screen, this is one of those fights that is just really hard to be on top of. Thankfully, they also don't have much health in the Colosseum, because if they did, this fight would be significantly more dangerous. The Oblobble is also the only duo battle in the game that doesn't get easier when the first Oblobble drops. The second one gains a health boost and enrages, doubling in speed both in terms of movement, the speed of their bullet hell, and the gaps between when they are and aren't shooting. This is one of the only boss phases in the game that feels like it's moving too fast. I mean, even the super bosses in the late game give you more time to dodge or punish than the enraged Oblobble does. In the Hall of Gods on my main save, there are only 4 bosses that I have not gotten Radiant on, and this is one of them. The fact you want to balance damage between two foes does give it a little boost in terms of engagement, but the second phase is just not fun to fight against. Speaking of Godhome, the Oblobbles get a huge health boost outside of the arena. In my recent challenge run, this was one of the only bosses I couldn't beat without using magic to burst it down. Though the existence of a second phase would give the Oblobbles a boost, the sloppy physics combined with the bullet hell makes the fight feel unsatisfying compared to other non-martial encounters in the game like Radiance or Soulmaster, meaning I think it earns a D grade. There's enough detail here with the healing and even to balance health in the first phase that I can't justify an F grade, but there is a lot holding this fight back from being an exciting challenge. The God Tamer is the other Colosseum fight, and reaching the God Tamer is so challenging that the player doesn't need to beat it to unlock the Pantheon it's found in the Godhome DLC. The God Tamer will be unlocked in the Hall of Gods after facing it just once in the Pantheon. To get to the God Tamer in the Colosseum, you need to beat about 126 enemies, including 2 Vengefly Kings, the Brooding Mawlek, and not 1, but 2 Soul Warriors. There are platforming sections where you have to dodge environmental attacks, sections with no platforms, and at the end of all of that, you finally reach the God Tamer. And honestly, compared to the Oblobbles, the God Tamer feels almost underwhelming. This is another duo fight, the God Tamer and the beast it calls God. Ironically, despite the God Tamer being the boss's namesake, the fight ends when the beast dies, not when the Tamer does. The Tamer herself has a single attack. She'll leap high into the air and bring her weapon down as a slam attack. Effectively, as long as you aren't overly aggressive or not paying attention, she's really a non-issue that just occasionally forces you to back away. The beast has 2 unique moves, and though they're both simple, they're both effective. The first and most common is a Watcher Knight-esque charge, but with a more pronounced bounce at the end. Similarly, nail hits won't bother the beast while it's charging, but magic can deal damage. That said, there's plenty of time after he lands to get some damage in. The other attack is an infected spit attack that leaves 3 globs on the ground for some lingering damage, while also allowing a quick player to leap leap up and land a few pogo hits before the spit comes out. The only time that the movesets overlap in any dangerous way is if there's a damage spot on the ground while a beast does a dash at the exact moment that the God Tamer decides to do a jump, and even then, if you have your Shade Dash ready, you can just use that to escape the situation without too much of an issue. The cruelest part of the fight is the lack of natural healing windows, especially this late into the Colosseum. With the speed the beast crosses the arena, any window to heal ends up being really precise. God Tamer is a far less frustrating end battle for the third Colosseum than the Oblobbles were for the second, but even with its health boosted in Godhome, the God Tamer feels incomplete. There's no evolution, and the moveset is tragically easy to learn. This is, of course, by design. The God Tamer was not designed as a boss, but as a final challenge when the player is already 15 to 20 minutes into a brutal gauntlet, having already fought multiple other small bosses and barely staying alive. And so though it's not a great boss in Godhome, it does exactly what it's supposed to do in the overworld. Personally, I think the fight still earns a spot near the top of the B grade. Though simple, it serves its role in the game really well, and though it's very rare I ever decide to actually do the third Colosseum, that lies more in the challenges that come before it than the boss itself. But now, it's rematch time, and we've got 4 rematches to go, and they are some of the game's finest duels. The rematches in the late game of Hollow Knight are a masterclass in how to take simpler fights and complicate them to create a satisfying challenge. So, to begin, is the only non-dream rematch of the bunch, the Hornet Sentinel. Firstly, the change in arena here does a lot to up the tension and stakes of the fight. Even if a potential person did not know the game or see the movesets at all, seeing these 2 arenas back to back meant that people could pretty accurately guess which one was an early game duel and which one is a late game battle. Hornet's visual design doesn't change or evolve here, but the soft greens of a large prior arena giving away to a violent snowstorm in a much more restrictive space make everything immediately more tense. On top of that, Hornet Sentinel blocks access to the King's Brand, one of the most important progression items in a true ending run. She ends up serving as the gateway into the faster late game boss challenges the true ending will pit you against. Like her first variation, the Hornet Sentinel's moveset is simple. She'll dash across the ground, leap into the air, and dash in the middle of her jumps. The only difference here is her speed. With the player now armed with a dash themselves, wall jumps for their own maneuverability, and more than likely the double jump, there are a lot more options to move around Hornet. It makes the moveset familiar but still feel unique. Aggressive play is a lot more rewarding here than it was in the first battle, where it was pretty easy to get yourself into a bad situation due to the player's lack of mobility options. Though Hornet still poses a real threat, the fact that you have so many options means the player feels their growth here more than in the other rematches. That said, her moveset does have some new tricks. Her Get Off Me AoE has doubled in size, and she's learned to parry. If you hit her in this state, she'll avoid the damage and respond with a fast, large swing. This parry move even ends up making its way into a couple of the late game fights, and though it does a good job initially checking aggression, once you know how to look for it and how long it'll take Hornet to leave the stance, it becomes more abusable than threatening. The biggest change to the moveset is her ability to slash in the air and spawn multiple spiky orbs held aloft by string. These are, naturally, hitboxes, but the player can hit them out of the air with their nail. Combined with Hornet's mobility and the smaller arena, these do a great job cutting the player's usable space off without ever feeling unfair, especially since the player can go for damage on Hornet or immediately try to reopen the arena back up as she spawns them in. This battle also serves as one of the most satisfying story beats in Hollow Knight. In your first battle, Hornet had little respect for the Knight, but here, Hornet seems almost curious and hopeful about the Knight's ability to change the state of Hollownest. Not only will beating her here confirm that she'll come in and help in the final boss fight, but it'll also allow her to spawn in after destroying Hera if you haven't already, giving Hornet a chance to open up about her past. And how does the game tell you that Hornet now respects you? Not via dialogue or text boxes, but through great wordless storytelling. After beating her, Hornet will let you pass through, still only half convinced that you can really change anything. But after the player has claimed the King's Brand, the tunnel will collapse on them and they'll find themselves pulled out of the rubble by Hornet, who without saying a word, dashes back off into the world. It is a great way to show that you've gained this new ally and helps get the player invested into Hornet as a character. There's a reason people are excited for Silksong. Half of it is to see more gameplay and level design from Team Cherry, yes, but the other half is that adoration for Hornet as a character. This fight and the sequence that follows carries a ton of weight. Overall, Hornet Sentinel is an expertly done rematch. Taking the first really required boss and speeding it up is a great way to wall off the final requirements to get into the a true ending, creating a satisfying beat right at the end of the game where the gameplay and story come full circle. Personally, I think she earns an S grade. That said, this is the 28th boss in this video, and if no DLC was released, the list would only be 34 bosses long rather than a 47 boss roster. With the DLC, Hornet Sentinel has adjusted a little from welcome to the endgame, and more of welcome to the real meat of Hollow Knight. Even with that adjustment, however, I think she still serves her role in the game progression beautifully. The next rematch is the only one of the 4 that ever does 2 damage on a hit, the Failed Champion, which is the rematch against the False Knight. And in this rematch, he doesn't just speed up, he goes postal. Where False Knight's moves and AI were carefully designed to never catch the player in an undodgeable scenario, the Failed Champion has absolutely no such qualms. After all, he expects that the players will have Shade Dash, Double Jump, and Dive to defend themselves if things get desperate. When it all comes together, the Failed Champion is one of the first fights that displays the satisfying design that Hollow Knight's endgame relies on. Challenge through simplicity. Even with the training wheels off, the moveset here is clear, concise, and fair. Outside of the aforementioned AI adjustments, speed is the biggest change here. Attacks coming out faster is always a risk on its own, but the speed increase also makes a secondary mechanic far more dangerous. When rocks fall from the ceiling, instead of just being a follow-up to his heavier attacks, the Failed Champion will now attack fast enough that you'll deal with the next attack on top of the bullet hell the rocks are creating. With those rocks still being able to be weaponized against him, it takes that simple mechanic and dials it up to 11. On top of that, the scale is increased. More rocks fall on each of his jumps and slams, and the shockwaves generated from each attack increase to max the vertical control players should have at this point. An excellent piece of design with the falling rocks existed in the False Knight, but matters a lot more here. Namely, that the rocks cannot pass through the champion. If he's airborne, being under him makes you safe for a moment, which does 3 big things. Firstly, the champion takes up a lot of the screen real estate, meaning it's easy for him to make it hard to see other attacks, meaning the player could be blindsided by rocks if this wasn't here. It avoids a lot of potential frustration. Second, it encourages the player to be in the champion's face as much as possible, something the aggression he put out often discourages. Especially getting into the late game, being able to stick to the side of a large boss, even amid their aggression, is a critical skill that the champion is cementing. Finally, it makes the champion feel like a physical part of the game's world. The collapsing arena interacts with both of you, which goes a long way towards making the fight feel as kinetic as it is. As I mentioned, some of the champion's attacks can deal 2 masks of damage. Unlike the Guardian, the champion only has select attacks that deal that higher amount. The shockwave, falling rocks, and the champion's body only deal 1 damage. Strikes with his mace are the only thing that's going to deal 2. Frankly, the fact that the champion's body doesn't deal 2 does feel a little bit off. There are bosses later where players can make the choice to take a 2 damage hit or to fall into a pit to minimize the damage taken. That option may exist here, but the choice is often to take the hit or move into the champion's body proper. These kind of moments have always felt video gamey to me. After all, a video game character would never think to avoid damage utilizing invincibility frames that exist solely for the user experience. But when the optimal strategy for the fight is to dash into the boss's body to take less damage, it feels a little backwards, all things considered. But with that said, I think the Failed Champion is an improvement on the False Knight, earning another A grade. The strangeness with damage takes away what is otherwise an astonishing proof as to the detail the False Knight hid behind his simplicity. The next rematch is with the Hollow Knight's resident mage, the Soul Master, returned now as the Soul Tyrant. Without dealing the same 2 damage that the Failed Champion can, though the speed of the Tyrant makes him an aggressive threat, the Soul Tyrant is usually actually the easiest of the 3 Dream rematches. Like the Failed Champion, everything the Tyrant does is a variation on the Master's moveset, amplified and intensified. The magic projectiles spawn and move faster, and his teleports move him around the arena at an even more breakneck pace, meaning the player needs to rush the Tyrant to even have a chance to land a single hit before he leaves again. His dive attacks are faster, and the shockwave has again doubled in size to account for the player likely having a double jump. Though, I should mention, it is exactly large enough to be jumped over with a single precise jump. The fake out dive, however, is a lot more dangerous here. There are definitely timings you can put yourself in where escaping the second hit requires an incredibly tight set of movement. The dash across the ground has sped up, but with the double jump and the player having more familiarity with pogo hits, it doesn't feel dangerous enough for a late game foe. On top of that, the speed makes it even easier to dodge because you can now just shade dash through it. You don't even need to jump over him. The attack that's made significantly more dangerous is when he summons an array of orbs, flies across the arena, and then teleports away as the orbs go flying back. Instead of creating 4 orbs in a square, there are now 6 of them, forming 2 difficult to dodge through walls, especially with the increased speed. While players are learning this fight, this is easily the hardest move to relearn. Frustratingly, the answer is just to stand in the middle of the arena. It even serves as a very safe moment to heal, since once you know where you're supposed to stand, it goes from the most threatening to an absolutely defanged attack. And though the increased speed means the second phase is harder, the moveset here remains completely identical. I feel like 1 or 2 more moves in the second phase could help catch the player off guard here, in the hope of recreating that same feeling of panic that the Soul Master did, because this just doesn't capture it. Though I rag on the Soul Tyrant's updates, the chassis of the Soul Master fight means the rematch is still fun. It just misses out on a lot of potential the other rematches reach. The Soul Master both pushes the player and the knight to their absolute limit, whereas the Soul Tyrant is a fun challenge that requires you to react faster, rather than pushing the knight to the same kind of limit that the Soul Master did. Overall, I think the Soul Tyrant is the only rematch that gets a lower grade than his first battle. He does still earn an A grade, however. It is a great fight, it just doesn't impress me or feel as momentous of an occasion as the first variation did. There are a lot of fast bosses in Hollow Knight, especially in the endgame, but I think the most breakneck fight by a pretty significant margin is actually the Lost Kin, the rematch with the Broken Vessel. Like the Soul Tyrant, the Lost Kin loses some of his atmospheric punch in the rematch. Though the beautiful theme is still present, it's a lot less shocking the second time around. Despite only dealing a single mask of damage, the Lost Kin still manages to be one of the fastest, most aggressive bosses in the entirety of Hollow Knight. Outside of being staggered, the Lost Kin is always on the move, with sped up versions of the Broken Vessel's attacks. He has the same dashes along the ground and air, he can swap to a nail strike in an instant now, and he can stop mid-air and dive downward really quickly. On top of that, the enemies he spawn in faster, and though they still only have 1 hit point, move a lot faster too. Uniquely, this is the only rematch that removes an attack from the boss. Namely, the Broken Vessel's bullet hell, where infection filled the screen, is gone. And with it, the only opportunity to wail away at the kin is gone as well. Everything that made the vessel work mechanically still works here, but with the challenge and speed cranked to the maximum. Outside of Hollow Knight's super bosses, this was by far the hardest boss in my blind playthrough. The demand of speed is so much higher than anything else. The summoned enemies dying in 1 hit and providing souls still works really well for rewarding player aggression, but it also means that healing is a really tall task. After all, these things spawn and reach you in often less than in 1 or 2 seconds, meaning that even if the last kin is staggered, you'll still need to be ready to keep that pressure up. Though the Lost Kin may not hit atmospherically in quite the same way that the Broken Vessel does, it is such a visceral fight that it rests above the vessel. It walks that delicate line between being a challenge and a super boss that must be fought in one specific way a lot better than a lot of other bosses in Hollow Knight. For that, the Lost Kin earns an S grade. Though he's not the best boss in the game, finally reaching the level of reaction that the kin demands and taking him down is one of my favorite moments in any playthrough. Finally leaving the world of dreams, we reach 2 bosses that are tough to place in a list. Personally, my plan was to structure these videos usually with base game, the DLCs, and then the final boss encounters. Hollow Knight, of course, has to make that as complicated as possible. The DLCs both offer a unique variation of the final boss, which means I can't talk about the last DLC before I talk about that final boss, and some DLCs changed boss fights from the main game almost past the point of recognizability, so the order from here on out is going to get a little bit odd. Starting off is another boss required for the true ending, the Traitor Lord. When Hollow Knight came out, the Traitor Lord was a pushover, to put it mildly. Being one of only 2 overworld bosses at the time that required that you have the Shade Dash, he was placed to be one of the last challenges in the game, and he frankly did not put out the threat necessary for that position in the overworld. He was just a larger, more tanky version of a standard Mantis enemy at this point. He used a dash attack and a leap into a dash attack. 2 moves for one of the final bosses ended up being a massive letdown. But when Lifeblood came out, Traitor Lord glowed up in a big way. What we have today is effectively a DLC boss fight. He got more health, more moves, and the moves he already had started to deal 2 damage per hit. And that's just the surface of everything happening with the Traitor Lord now. To To begin, this is the only boss in the game that requires that you fight mobs prior to getting a chance to take on the boss properly. Except, of course, the Pantheons in Godhome, but we'll get to that later. I'm not certain if this was a change made in the Lifeblood update, but it makes the Traitor Lord feel a lot more weighty than most boss fights. With that said, I also wish that we saw the Traitor Lord before he just appeared randomly. Maybe if he was in the background and clearly sent the Mantises to swarm us, just to make it clear that this was more than a standard fight from the moment it begins, because as it stands, it just feels like a mob fight, and then suddenly, Traitor Lord is here. Even with the update, his base moves are still based on those basic Mantis enemies that he was sending forward, but now dealing 2 damage a hit. A pogo over the dash can create a good opening, and just standing and punishing the jump fills most of the fight. But the Traitor Lord is designed around the shadow dash. Dashing through both of his dashes is a great way to get out of a tight spot, but his ground pound attack, new from Lifeblood, covers the entire screen vertically, requiring you to use your Shade Cloak in order to dash through and avoid damage. The fact that this boss is required for the true ending is important here, because this is another of those introductions of a move that the Radiance uses, namely, the Sunbeam that goes across the screen. Past that, he can throw some infected boomerangs at a distance, using a much more complicated pattern than the ranged Mantises. So long as you're being aggressive, however, you usually don't need to worry about learning this attack, since he only does it if you're at a distance. On top of all this, if you've done Cloth, who is an NPC's quest line, she'll end up joining in the fight, leaping around with her club to land a few hits. The tragedy here is that, if Cloth joined the fight, when the Traitor Lord goes down, he'll kill Cloth as his final action, and she'll land the final blow in retaliation. It makes for a good culminating moment for Cloth's story, and it's not nearly as hard to find as other similar battles in these Souls-like games, like Siegward was. I really enjoy the enhancements to the Traitor Lord. The moveset is still simple enough that it's not overwhelming, but an increase to damage, speed, and the new attacks made one of the final boss challenges in this game feel like he earned a spot this late in the story. I think he earns another A grade. There are few things as satisfying as learning the Traitor Lord's moveset and absolutely obliterating him. Well, we're already talking about the Lifeblood update, so everything's already out of order. So, before we head back to the Hidden Dreams content, we might as well talk about what must be by far the easiest of the update bosses, the Hive Knight. The Hive Knight isn't necessarily easier because he's a letdown or has some gimmick, far from it. The Hive Knight is just the result of Team Cherry creating the Hive in the base game and not putting a boss into it, leading to a lot of people saying that the Hive was disappointing. So, in the final room, they've patched in the Hive Knight. He's designed for an endgame area rather than being designed as a final challenge like most of the other update opponents were. The Hive Knight is primarily a melee boss with a couple teleportation abilities that keep him feeling mobile and unique. Each of his lunges and stings are well telegraphed as he dashes straight forward or teleports to the player's vertical level and holds in the air for a moment before darting forward. With the Shade Dash, this fight becomes a little too easy, but without it, it is an incredibly dynamic battle. On top of his melee attacks, the Hive Knight also spits up small bees that fly down in the general direction of the player, serving as a threat while the Hive Knight continues to attack, while also providing a window to land a few free hits while he's summoning them. If you land a knockdown and wait to ensure there are less bees remaining, it makes for a fun back and forth, and knowing that you might be just 1 or 2 hits away from a knockdown during that bee storm makes you really want to keep up the aggression. After all, if he stops, you'll be out of the much more dangerous situation of dealing with the bee bullet hell and the melee attacks at once, and the bees don't follow the player enough to make attacking impossible, just enough that they are a constant threat you need to be aware of. The last of his attacks summons 3 orbs with needles sticking out of all 8 major directions. Where these orbs spawn seems to be completely random, and after a moment they explode all at once, overlapping with each other to create another bullet hell. I'm much less of a fan of this move compared to the bees. The orbs can be interacted with and knocked away, but the delay on the burst is really short here, not giving the player much time at all to react. And the Hive Knight will frequently go back to attacking as the orbs start to explode, meaning that you're dodging 3 strangely placed grids and the Hive Knight at the same time, which makes for a much more demanding attack than the rest of the fight. But with that said, the Hive Knight definitely improves the area he resides in. He may not be the perfect encounter with a moveset easily overcome by Shade Dash and a frustrating set of projectiles, but I think he still earns a B grade. And no, I promise I'm not just giving him that grade for the pun, he actually gets a B grade. He also gets a shout out for the official worst run back in Hollow Knight. I loathe running through the Hive here, so please put down your Dream Gate and never do this run back normally. But returning back to that first Hidden Dream update now, we'll get a few more bosses that feel like they belonged in the main game. The first of which is a dream rematch with the Dung Defender at his peak as the White Defender. Lore-hungry players are eating very well here. Within Ogrim's dream, 5 silhouetted figures watched the rematch. The Pale King on his throne in the center, and the 4 other knights, each off to the side, watching Ogrim throw his entire being into this battle. Other dream bosses definitely got a mechanical upgrade as we previously discussed, but the White Defender has increased the challenge to make him one of the final bosses a player will usually experience. Not only are his attacks faster, but he also spawns more projectiles, his health has more than doubled from your first encounter, and he no longer staggers. And with the Defender being as aggressive as he is, that means that every heal the player uses here has to be very carefully earned. Fun fact, the White Defender is actually tied with the Pure Vessel as the second most individual health in the game, only beaten by the Radiances, and also by Oro and Mato in the Sister of Battle's combined health bars, but like I said, individual health bars. This makes the fight feel a lot more significant. Now it feels like a final challenge, and it really makes the final emotional catharsis the fight builds to feel earned. When the Defender is beaten, he'll reach up towards the 5 silhouettes on the pedestal, almost desperate before the dream ends. For such a bubbly character and fight, it makes for an almost tragic ending to the battle, and conveys Ogrim's story and characterization beautifully. He feels like the one knight who could never stand with the others, and yet he's somehow the only one still fighting. Even within his own dream, he fails to live up to the legacy he wants to uphold. You can rematch his dream up to 5 times, and the number of masks he deals with each hit increases each rematch, until he's dealing 5 damage in a single hit. Beyond the lack of knockdowns, there's one more big change to the Defender. You can no longer knock him out of the ground with dives, which means you have to learn to dodge the attacks instead, which I personally find a lot more engaging and dangerous, even though it's just as easy to punish with an Abyss Shriek. His low health attack becomes a bit more dangerous because of this, as you can no longer interrupt him when he bursts out of the ground in rapid succession. Despite all these enhancements, I think the White Defender still stays out of what I'd consider super boss territory, only providing the option for players to choose to take him on with the increased damage, which puts him more in that field. Though he is an exceptional challenge, especially on my most recent run, he isn't fast enough to be impossible or require memorization. The White Defender fits in with the rest of the game's catalog as an endgame challenge. The White Defender earns the S grade that the Dung Defender missed out on. It maintains all the things that the first battle did well, while adding to the atmosphere in a way that other dream matches didn't do, while also providing an escalation and challenge that makes him an exciting foe to revisit. How do I describe the second boss of the Hidden Dreams update? What words could possibly be conjured to invoke the emotions stirred within players' hearts from this encounter? How about invincible, fearless, sensual, mysterious, enchanting, vigorous, diligent, overwhelming, gorgeous, passionate, terrifying, beautiful, powerful? But could that even possibly describe the Grey Prince Zote? Zote is an NPC that the player runs into throughout the game, usually having gotten himself into some sort of lethal peril. Eaten by the Vengefly King, stuck in Deep Nest, kept by the Colosseum of Fools for their entertainment. Fighting the actual Zote looks like this. The Grey Prince Zote, on the other hand, is what Britta, a hopeless romantic NPC, thinks of Zote after hearing his stories about his quote-unquote adventures. The atmosphere and design of this fight is excellent. After a long drop down through a display of paintings and art of Zote, you find Britta being treated as a queen, and her Grey Prince rises up with his usual battle cry before the music kicks into gear and the fight begins. Truth, Beauty, and Hatred, which serves as Zote's boss theme, is one of my single favorite pieces of music in the game. The dancing strings over the heavy brass section make Zote simultaneously feel powerful and threatening, while also capturing the wild whimsy and chaos of this moveset. And frankly, chaotic does not go far enough describing the kinds of shenanigans that Zote uses here. He'll wave his nail around wildly while following the player before he trips and falls on his own face, which causes shockwaves to come out from him. He'll leap into the air and come crashing down, but sometimes he'll do this mid-air pirouette to readjust his location, and other times he'll similarly fall on his face and not actually do anything. He'll spit out fly versions of himself to hunt down the player, and occasionally just hop around as a big hitbox. And with all this considered, Zote Zote becomes one of the single hardest bosses to learn in this game. Though he's not the hardest boss in the game by a pretty wide margin, there are so many fake-outs and trips that half the time the threat that Zote outputs is completely unrelated to whatever he's trying to do, and that makes his moveset really difficult to read, especially when compared to the precision of the rest of the game. I've seen people go both ways on this fight. Some players love the charm and chaos and characterization it brings, and others hate how it lacks the clarity and intent and animation that Hollow Knight excels at. Personally, I think the fight works on multiple levels. As I mentioned, it's characterizing for both Zote and Britta, while still providing a unique gameplay challenge that no other boss in the game really does. And though that moveset is bizarre, it can still be learned, even if it's easier said than done. There is one more fun detail that Zote uses to stick out that I already kind of alluded to. Like the White Defender, the Grey Prince Zote evolves as you beat him repeatedly, dealing more damage and gaining more attacks. The two biggest new ones being Spider Zotes that leap around the arena, and Explosive Zotes that make finding a safe place incredibly difficult. In Godhome and the Pantheon of Hollow Nest, Zote starts with each of these attacks unlocked, even when his damage is still normal. And as you beat the Dream Zote, Britta, in the real world, begins to realize Zote is, and has always been, a fucking idiot. I think Grey Prince Zote earns an A grade. His characterization and momentum forge him into a satisfying in-game challenge, but the lack of clarity does make fighting him at higher damage levels a more than frustrating prospect. Grimm is a really tough boss to analyze. On a first playthrough, he seems like a solid opponent. His moveset is detailed, but there's nothing nearly as dangerous as the other endgame threats. His health is even on the lower side compared to the DLC foes, and his stagger leaves huge windows of opportunity to heal. He ends up feeling like a late to mid-game boss rather than an endgame opponent, which means the fight will often end right as you've started really getting invested into the battle. The moveset doesn't have anything too wild to catch you off guard. He can dash forwards or backwards with claw swipes and descending fire blasts, throw bats out as projectiles, and create long spikes from the ground, giving you an opportunity to attack if you stay close to him. On top of that, at certain health gates, he'll create a bullet hell AoE that makes the player focus on vertical dodging and makes him immune to all basic nail strikes for a moment. If the player wants, they can keep on the pressure with magic, and tying this to his health bar gives the fight a really natural overall rhythm, despite the lack of any visible health bar. But with all that said, that's not to say that Grimm is a disappointing fight. Despite being on the easier side of these update battles, Grimm is here to set the atmosphere for the Grimm troops' real boss encounter. The light accordion music at the beginning and end of the battle, combined with the audience cheering for the fight, the way the music becomes wild and violent during the bullet hell attacks, and the way the fight ends with him landing back in the arena with a bow. Pleased at your demonstration, it's all pitch perfect. Even after you've beaten Grimm here, he still feels threatening, which is good because his real boss fight absolutely is. One final cool detail is that, if you attack Grimm at the beginning of the fight while he's bowing, he'll scream in rage and immediately enter a bullet hell. The reason I love this so much is because nothing else has phased Grimm. Even when he loses the fight, his reaction is pretty muted overall. This scream, however, completely removes all of Grimm's proper veneer of the circus master and reveals how mad he truly is. The first battle with Grimm earns an A grade. The battle is a dance lesson, teaching you Grimm's move in a straightforward duel before he'll send you back into the world to fetch the last couple flames you need to reach the real encounter. And with that, I want to start by saying that the Nightmare King Grimm is a heavy contender for my single favorite boss fight of all time. I have run into a ton of bosses in games that have taken my breath away, bosses that have left me in tears by the end, bosses that have pushed my skill to its breaking point, but there is something about the Nightmare King Grimm that just works. I know 6 different people who have beaten Nightmare King Grimm, all of them with varying personal skill levels. Every single one of them, however, had nearly the exact same experience. They reached the boss fight, began it, and died within 30 seconds. Then, they spent around 3 hours ramming their head into him over and over again. When this fight is executed correctly, on a fully upgraded player, the fight takes about 3 to 4 minutes if you're going slowly. So 3 hours is a lot. of attempts. But despite attempt after attempt after attempt, I never saw anyone get mad at Nightmare King Grimm. There was no frustration, just that desire to try one more time, to figure out that one extra attack, to try to get a little bit further as you realize that what initially felt impossible and overwhelming is a fair and well choreographed dance that Nightmare King Grimm forces you to learn. Taking Grimm's attacks as a base, the Nightmare King Grimm improves on every single one of them. The bat attack has sped up, but a jump into a dash now travels straight through each of them, allowing for a hit. The claw forward leaves just enough of a beat to hit him before he leaps into the air for a rainfall of fire that's hard to dodge if you weren't pressed close to where he ended the dash. And the spike attacks now have Grimm teleport away and leave you less time to react, meaning they are now entirely just an attack to avoid before he reappears. And on top of the speed, everything now deals 2 masks of damage, except for falling off the ledge at the sides of the arena. That only deals 1. At 75%, 50%, and 25%, he will make you aware that the fight is progressing with those bullet hells, which have sped up pretty significantly from Grimm. Where Grimm suggested an increase in musical intensity, Nightmare King Grimm's soundtrack is the single most violent and electronic piece in this soundtrack. The force behind his theme is wild, and being the first boss on today's list with a title card that pops up before the fight, it means that the force the theme has smashing onto the player's screen with the huge title Nightmare King Grimm is incredibly terrifying. On top of that, Grimm's placement in the world is designed to remove every possible frustration of death. There is no loss of resources, no shade to collect, no charms that can break. You wake up right next to Grimm, immediately ready to hit the dream nail and dive right back into the battle. The game wants you and begs you to try again and again and again until that moment you finally take him down. The stagger gap now is just long enough to heal a single hit point, and the tempo and nature of the moveset encourages the player to never stop attacking or moving towards Grimm, as trying to heal amid the array of attacks is not very realistically done. On top of that, the stagger here has him break into a collection of Grimm childs, only one of whom is real. Grimm did do the same thing, but this animation makes staggering Grimm feel really unique compared to usually just knocking the boss off balance for a moment, and pushes the Dracula vibe even further forward. This was actually the first boss that I completed Radiant in Godhome, which, to the uninitiated, means I beat it damageless. Without causing any frustration, the Nightmare King Grimm teaches you the dance of his battles so expertly that by the end of it, it is drilled into your mind permanently. Even in this challenge playthrough with no spells, healing, charms, or nail upgrades, I beat Nightmare King Grimm on my 12th attempt despite the battle lasting over 10 minutes. Cementing this moveset into your mind is so critical that he ended up being one of the easiest endgame bosses when I went back to the game. If you hadn't figured out already, the Nightmare King Grimm is an S-grade foe. I'm frankly not even sure what else to even say. Even without the rest of this artful roster of bosses, the Nightmare King Grimm alone would make Hollow Knight a game that I recommend to anyone who enjoys action games. I debated pretty heavily where to place the Hollow Knight fight on this list, because for most endings this is the game's final boss, and I have not even touched the last DLC. Despite this, I feel like the Hollow Knight and Radiance need to be discussed before we travel to Godhome. As the true namesake of the game, the Hollow Knight is another fight dripping with atmosphere and wordless storytelling. You enter the arena and the music begins, quiet but building to something clearly significant. Light strings that slowly layer on top of each other as you start to break the chains holding the Hollow Knight in place. And as the music builds more and more, with more instruments pile in, you break the last chain and he falls. The music comes to a screeching halt and he screams in pain as his proper theme begins. The music is as grand as you'd expect a final boss to be, though the moveset leans towards the simpler side, all things considered. The Hollow Knight has a 3-hit combo that can be pogoed over or shade dashed through if you've unlocked it, and a long charge that can be handled in about the same way. Like Hornet, you can also enter a parry stance, punishing any aggression with a huge swing, though like Hornet's, the move is very easy to avoid and punish as the parry is dropping. As the fight progresses, however, the Hollow Knight's moveset evolves. First, he starts to add infection attacks, a bullet hell of orbs that can be dodged very easily at a distance, or dashed through in order to deal a few more melee hits. With Shade Dash, it's very easy to press through, and without it, it ends up being a lot more precise. After that, a huge leaping slam creates pillars that burst from the ground, which is the only thing that deals 2 masks of damage. With these, the variety of the moveset really encourages and requires mobility, punishing any player who's jumped too early for melee strikes with leaping attacks of his own, while still providing plenty of windows for the player to push in. Since most attacks deal only 1 damage and the Shade Dash counters most of his moves, it ends up being a simple fight if you're fully leveled and geared out, but a very tough fight for any under-geared player. But where the fight really steps up is about halfway through, when the Hollow Knight joins the fight alongside you. His mind breaks free of the infection, and he starts to stab himself, leaving you a huge window to attack. The music takes a turn for the solemn here, and the knockdown animations lose the snappiness as the Hollow Knight's body starts to collapse and fail him. His basic nail attacks begin to phase out of his moveset as the infection begins to lift what's left of his corpse into the air and create bullet hells of infection, or slam him down as a weapon towards the player. All the attacks can be dodged and punished in a similar way, with the slam in particular having a really satisfying rhythm to get in hits between the slams. But the warrior that began this fight is completely dead by the end of it. In his last phase of health, his nail attacks have vanished completely, and there are 3 possibilities here. If the player has not fulfilled the requirements for the true ending, the fight continues as normal, until the Hollow Knight dies. If the player has done a Hornet's second fight, she'll fly into the arena and pin down the Hollow Knight for a moment, giving the player an opportunity to land a few hits before Hornet is flung to the ground, where she lies for the rest of the battle. Or, if the player draws an Awakened Dream Nail, they can enter into the mind of the Hollow Knight, which is where they face the game's true final boss. The Hollow Knight is an S-grade fight. The emotional storytelling as the Hollow Knight is completely lost, becoming more and more a weapon of the infection as the melee moveset melts away, is incredible. And all the endings, whether it be the Radiance, Simple Victory, or Hornet's death, create incredible emotional climaxes to the entire experience. As I mentioned in the Hollow Knight fight, if a player is well equipped with a fully upgraded nail, spells, and health, then he collapses pretty quickly and without much challenge. That's because every time a player attempts the true final boss, they have to fight through the Hollow Knight, and that would be a lot more frustrating if the knight took more than a minute or 2 to get through. And that's because the Radiance was, upon release, the single hardest boss in the base game, and it was not even a competition. He is now objectively not the hardest boss in the game, but the Radiance was leagues above everything else for a long while. The Radiance is a 5-phase boss fight, and the player's health is restored to full after the Hollow Knight battle is done. The battle begins on a flat, small arena with the Radiance floating above it. The only way to damage it is to leap up and land an attack in between a barrage of magical attacks, of which she has a ton, all of which, like many of the super bosses, deal 2 damage. She is constantly teleporting around the arena, meaning the player has to be aggressive constantly here, and with no stagger, the assault that the Radiance puts out has no plans on stopping, meaning healing is a constant challenge. Nails can come from the side, leaving a gap to be manually dodged through, or being fast enough that they can be shade dashed through. Nails can fall from the sky, requiring the player to navigate around them, and that previously mentioned pillar of light that has to be shade dashed through. It means that she can cover the entire arena with damage, especially since the Radiance often overlaps these 3 attacks with other attacks. Those other attacks being that she can create a ring of nails that spread out in a spinning pattern, create a safe network of light beams that burst out for damage 3 times in a row, and summons 3 orbs that track the player really tightly, punishing them for spending too much time in the air, which is of course where the player is forced to be while trying to attack the Radiance. As I already slightly mentioned, one of the best things about this moveset is how many moves are introduced earlier in the game. The tracking orbs are from the Soul Master and Tyrant boss fights, the sunbeams are a more advanced version of Gorb's nails, the vertical and horizontal nails call back to platforming in the White Palace, the pillar of light with the shockwave that the Traitor Lord used. The only completely new attack is the ring of nails she makes around herself, which means learning what she's capable of doing isn't complicated. The complicated part is executing all of this as the fight grows more and more chaotic over time. The second phase is a small shift, and there's not a definitive line like most phase transitions. Half the arena glows and then grows spikes that will deal 1 massive damage. After a short time, those spikes disappear and the other side of the arena begins to glow. And the Radiance doesn't change what it's doing from the first phase at all here. It'll happily teleport over the spikes, and the barrage of attacks shows no sign of ending. Personally, I find this to be my least favorite of the 5 phases. Though a player can technically pogo on the spikes while also attacking the Radiance, the risk of doing so is a lot higher than many of the other high skill level counters to bosses. And with how fast paced the fight can be while you're learning it, the player isn't really encouraged to go for riskier punishes in the way they are with things like the Hollow Knight's repeated slams. The third phase is a bit of a difficulty break, but serves as almost a moment of held breath before the final charge. Covering the edges of the arena in spikes, the Radiance moves to the center of the arena and calls nails from the sky. These nails do not stop until her health bar has been knocked into the next phase. My favorite part about the nails here are that, though there are large enough gaps to sneak through, the space between any 2 nails is exactly large enough that the player can slip through it as well. And it's one of the most satisfying things to pull off as you're knocking down the Radiance, or the player can choose to play it safe and move towards the gaps. At the end of this phase, the Void starts to make an appearance, breaking the golden atmosphere of the arena as something tries to pull the Radiance down. It doesn't last for long, however, as the Radiance teleports back into the sky, creating platforms that beg the player to follow. There's enough time here to use 6 heals before the player is forced to follow suit. Any longer, and the Void will begin to rise, dealing damage as a death plane from this point forward. The fourth phase is easily the hardest of the Radiance's phases, and by a pretty wide margin. Instead of just one large platform, you get small floating areas in a much larger space, and the Radiance's attacks have not changed. It's very rare you'll get something entirely impossible to dodge, but the chance of 2 bad attacks lining up, especially with how much harder the orbs are to shake without the help of a large space to absorb them, and how difficult getting to the Radiance can become as you push your way across the entire arena for a single hit, this is the phase with the highest chance of becoming frustrating to a player. Doing the Hollow Knight and the first half of this fight only for the Radiance to use her hardest to dodge moves and teleport to the worst possible places can be really disheartening for a new player. The final phase of the fight does bring it back around, as the Radiance teleports upwards one final time for the only boss phase in the game that boasts a single hit point. The player begins to climb these small platforms as the music gives way to a ringing drone. The Radiance begins to use its Sunbeam attack, but now with only a single beam focused on the player. As the player rises, the beam becomes more and more accurate, locking onto the player completely as they've almost finished their ascension. Once the player does reach the top and lands a final blow, the fight is over. The spirit of the Hollow Knight appears and holds the Radiance open as the Knight is consumed by the void that was following it, unleashing this barrage of attacks that brings the game to a satisfying close. There's a lot to love with the Radiance. The music and the lack of it at the ending works really well here, showing the extent of the infection's cruelty and monstrous nature via the Hollow Knight before giving that infection a face via the Radiance, ends up doing some great wordless storytelling, and the design of the Radiance being the entire sun in the background works really well for scale. The atmosphere of the well-lit arena also makes the unique visuals of the fight feel suitably like a finale. There are, on top of the issues I've already mentioned, a couple other small ones. The first being that it's often hard to track yellow orbs against a yellow background, especially since they're often the hardest attack to dodge in the small platform phase. Bad teleport and attack luck, as I mentioned, can completely kill the momentum that the fight otherwise keeps going pretty well, and it also ends up being one of the buggier fights in the game. There are a lot of videos on YouTube that you can find of the Void rising up and consuming the entire arena, leading to an instant death for the player. And in a multiple phase endurance battle, that can honestly be even worse than a hard-to-see attack. But even with all those minuses, the spectacle and catharsis of those final blows make this boss a worthwhile final battle to culminate the game, earning an A grade. It may not emotionally affect me as much as the Hollow Knight did, but it rides on that battle's coattails to an incredibly satisfying conclusion. But with that, it is time to head into the final and largest update. Godmaster. All 8 of the next bosses I run over will lead to a hidden secret ending that is infinitely harder to reach than the rest of the game by an absurd margin. To reach the new final boss of Godhome, you have to complete 4 pantheons, each featuring a 10 boss long boss rush using bosses of the base game and ending with a new final boss. The first of these unique final bosses are the Nail Master brothers Oro and Mato, which means it's time to talk about some lore. In the base game, there were 3 Nail Masters the player could find, Oro, Mato, and Sheo, who would teach you nail arts, namely a dash slash, a cyclone dash, or a great slash accordingly. Though a little tougher to use than pairing quick slash and unbreakable strength together, these arts still made the masters feel powerful, and in their dialogue, you learned of a falling out between Oro and Mato, the 2 brothers who were once close and, in reality, have not spoken for some time. The battle here in Godhome begins with Oro, using a moveset fairly reminiscent of the Watcher Knights. A huge side slash followed by a downward slash, a leap into the air followed by an easy to predict slam, or using the dash slash art that he taught the player to flash across the arena quickly. The moveset is aggressive but pretty easy to learn overall. As Oro falls, however, Mato jumps into the arena. The brothers see each other again, and all their hatred is lost, as you get to see them at their peak. The brothers working in perfect sync, even after years apart. In a lot of duo fights, even when the AI is taking what the other enemy is doing into account, they'll still feel like unique enemies. Even in the Mantis Lords boss fight, it felt like a group of attacks coming at you from separate sources. Oro and Mato here feel almost like a single entity with most of what they do, only breaking their careful dance if you've placed yourself between them. They'll leap in and out of combat together with jump and basic attacks, or utilize the dash slash or Mato's cyclone in order to surround you or push you against a wall. Once they've surrounded you, they can sometimes synchronize their basic attacks too, or at any point they can leap back to back and slam down. All of this is incredibly satisfying. As I mentioned though, there is one way that the attacks can desync. If you're attacking Oro and Mato in a recovery frame for one of the major attacks, they might choose to launch into a basic attack on you while the other brother continues as usual, which can lead to some difficult or frankly impossible to dodge situations. The occasions are pretty few and far between, but players will usually run into things being a little off at least a couple of times in a run. But as they learn the tempo of the fight, they can begin to use this desync to open up larger windows, or to risk more hits and gamble that they can dodge the unsynced attacks. The biggest issue here is that once one of the brothers goes down, there is no evolution to the fight. It returns back to the first phase, but now with the downed brother sitting there, making visibility a little tougher. Like the Mantis Lords, it's not bad, but it does mean that the battle loses its momentum instead of ending at its peak. I slightly mentioned this before, but outside of the Radiance variations, Oro and Mato have one of the highest combined health pools in the game. The only thing that gets higher is the Sisters of Battle. I think Oro and Mato are right at the top of an A grade. It's a fun fight, and though the occasional overlap can be frustrating, the emotional feeling of watching these 2 brothers work in unison again makes up for the small mistakes that do exist. I wasn't sure immediately if Uumuu in Godhome was different enough to count as a separate boss. All his aggressive moves are the same, and the only difference is that there's now a new method to deal damage since Squirrel isn't here. In addition to his usual attacks, Uumuu now has an attack that summons Omas. When killed, they'll turn into projectiles that home in on the player and explode for 2 masks of damage. If that projectile hits Uumuu, it now breaks his invulnerability and does 100 damage, meaning you never have to do this cycle more than 2 or 3 times at the absolute most. There are a couple really neat tricks that come in with this method of damage, like using Vengeful Spirit to carry the bomb into Uumuu, or needing to worry more about positioning as you try to find the opportunity to land a hit on Uumuu that does make his attacks a lot more dynamic than just stand still and run in a circle. The biggest issue with this new mechanic is that there's nothing really discouraging you from face tanking the blasts. With Uumuu still on the lower side of aggression and health, blowing yourself up and then attacking Uumuu before landing and healing your health back up is a very valid strategy, which removes that interesting back and forth that the fight tries to create via this new mechanic. On top of that, Once you have figured out the tricks, the fight becomes too simple. It may be hard to get the upper hand when you're still learning how to manipulate the tracking projectiles, but it ends up being too easy once you do, which means there's no golden zone where Uumuu hits right where he needs to be in terms of challenge. It's still better than the overworld variation, earning a C grade. Though it lacks the story of Quirrell, it's a lot more engaging of a battle since there's a lot more thinking and positioning that come into play. It just lacks the scaling necessary for the battle to remain interesting throughout. The second of the Godmaster boss fights, and the third of the Nailmasters, Sheo is the Nailmaster who has given up on violence completely and instead taken up a life of painting. So, of course, for his battle, he combines the skills that he once had with paint to create one of the most colorful and exciting battles in the game. Every attack here has a different color. The long stab across the arena sprays yellow paint, a huge forward slash creates blue paint orbs, and a leaping bullet hell into a slam uses red paint. His great slash art uses purple paint, and causes paintballs to rain from the sky over his next attack. There is an incredible sense of momentum and progression in the fight as the usually extraordinarily and sometimes problematically clinical Godhome arena becomes drenched in these dynamic colors that pile on top of each other in just the best way. The issue that holds Sheo back a lot is that despite being the second Godmaster duel and having less overall aggression than the duo fight that came before, Sheo has way less health than the other brothers, and considering he's not that hard to keep pressure on, it is a shame that he lingers behind so much of the DLC. All of it is balanced around being fully upgraded and leveled. To give you an idea of scale, Oro and Mato had a combined 2100 health over the course of the battle. Sheo only clocks in at 950, and especially if you decide to go all out with spells, aggression, and charms, that means he folds like a piece of paper with no effort. Despite the impeccable art direction, which is some of the game's best, it does mean that he's trapped in the A grade. I love how the paint layers over itself, but Sheo is even less of a threat than Grimm, who was an atmospheric-focused battle that introduced a moveset, whereas Sheo never gets to evolve. And the third of the Godmaster encounters is the Nailsage, the one who taught Oro Mato and Sheo. Sly, a very tiny fly with a very big sword. This moveset is frankly hilarious to fight, and though overwhelming at first, ends up being one of my favorite ones to learn and master. Sly uses moves very similar to Oro and Mato. A 2-hit combo followed by turning into a Beyblade that rushes towards the player, as well as a leaping slam followed by a huge swing that only comes out if the player is too close. He also has the Cyclone Spin, Dash Slash, and Great Slash, with the Great Slash dealing 2 masks of damage. The biggest thing that works with this moveset is how much of it is predictable follow-ups based on the player's spacing. When you start, the attacks feel natural, and his ability to change direction mid-combo can make him very hard to dodge, but behind the huge swings are clear openings and punish windows to break past that comically large sword and get in 1 or maybe even 2 hits before you dart away again. The fact that he can turn mid-combo also means that you can never wail on him in the same way players could wail on Sheo or the other brothers. His stagger is also hilarious, as his nail will go flying across the arena, leaving enough time for a hit or a heal before he'll teleport away, grab the nail, and sprint back towards you. There's so much character in this fight, while it still feels like a culmination of the Nailmaster fights that came before. He also only has a little more health than Sheo, but with damage being so much harder to earn here, that same health goes a lot further. His second phase also serves as a great final challenge while still maintaining the characterization of the battle. Leaping into the air, he gives a war cry before he begins to dart around the arena wildly, occasionally spinning towards the player as a Beyblade, leaving them just a moment to hit him before he begins to bounce around again. At first, the attack feels insanely overwhelming, but once you notice the pattern and can figure out when he's going to lunge at you, he ends up pretty easy to predict. You don't watch the bouncing, you watch for when he's redirecting towards you, step away a little bit, and punish him. You repeat this just a few times, and Sly is down. Considering that Nailsage Sly is a chaotic teacher of the nail arts, the trick to the final phase being to focus, relax, and simplify makes the whole exchange feel like a final exam, like the Nailsage is giving you a final test before he declares you ready for the challenges still to come. It is a great conclusion to the last 3 fights, and escalates the challenge the last bosses will bring without being overly demanding himself. He aligns his thematic elements and gameplay really expertly. And because of this, I think Sly does just barely edge his way into the S grade. He's fun and engaging, utilizing that reactive moveset to make him feel unlike a lot of other battles in Hollow Knight, and I love everything that he does. Also, bowing to him at the end is one of the only things that kept me moderately sane within the pantheon of Hallownest. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit with boss order again. There are two variations of main bosses in the Pantheon that require you to beat the 4th Godhome boss to access, but the bosses lack a lot of the final punch that the big two bosses of Godhome are going to have, so I figured I should break them down before I break down the super bosses. As you may have guessed, the Sisters of Battle are our first encounter here that serves as a major variation off the base game boss fight, namely, and kind of obviously, being a variation of the Mantis Lords. Their health scales pretty significantly for endgame here, but the biggest change is that Team Cherry takes the already chaotic fight against two Mantises and increases the challenge in the only way that would make sense. All three of them attack the player at one time. All the moves here are the same as they were before, but the attacks now come far faster, with occasional downward slams while you're dodging the spear throws from wall-mounted sisters. You'd think that the delicate tempo of the Mantis Lords would become too much with all three here, but this fight feels incredible. That same sense of momentum and constant aggression that made the Mantis Lords work so well has now escalated to endgame, and with the combination of Shade Dash, better control over pogoing, and more spells to punish the sisters, the player has enough options that the balance here feels just as good, if not better. The biggest issue is the same as it was with the Mantis Lords proper, though the sisters do a little bit better. As the Mantis sisters drop out, the fight slows down rather than ending at the climax. Counting down from 3, however, does mean that there is still enough of a threat that the drop in tension is much more gradual than the sheer drop-off that most duo fights in Hollow Knight have had. I still wish there was something to end this phase with, but the fight holds up despite it. Like the Mantis Lords, the Sisters of Battle are another S-grade foe, resting just above the Mantis Lords in my personal rankings. In endgame scaled, Mantis Lords would already be amazing, but this fight just takes that one extra step that makes it feel exceptional. The other boss that gets a new variation sadly does not do quite as well. When you encounter Nosk in the final Pantheon, you run into one disguising itself as Hornet rather than the Knight, and it transforms into the Winged Nosk. The design similarly looks great here, but unfortunately this enemy has less in common with the already disappointing Nosk, and more in common with the Vengefly King. Winged Nosk will fly across the ground, providing an opportunity to pogo off an attack, and can summon infection blobs that can be killed in one hit. The exact moves of the Vengefly King, but with endgame stats and a more unique visual theme. It does have 2 additional infection attacks, one that creates a bullet hell with lingering infection, and the other dropping infection from the ceiling that, similarly, will linger on the ground for a moment. But the lingering infection here doesn't do nearly as much as it did in the first Nosk, because standing and waiting for the sweep attack is the best way to deal damage here, so not being able to move is not at all a problem. It is better than the Vengefly King just off atmosphere alone, but the fight is still pretty dull, and whereas the Sister of Battle took the strengths of the Mantis Lords and amplified them, the things that made Nosk still earn an above average grade are all missing here, as Winged Nosk's habit of flying up and out of the way means that she is a very unthreatening enemy. Magic and having the double jump help a little bit compared to the first fight with the Vengefly King, but not enough to make the fight engaging. I think Winged Nosk earns a high D grade. It's a below average fight, but the addition of some bullet hell elements does add a little more excitement, even if it just as quickly ends up being frustrating as you just wait for Nosk to move somewhere where you're allowed to attack. The final of the 4 main Pantheon bosses is another upgraded boss. This time, the Hollow Knight has been given a true final boss treatment. All his attacks are faster, deal 2 damage, and he has a ton of new tricks that make this fight infinitely more threatening. The slow-moving orbs have been replaced by much harder to dodge knives that almost demand a shadow dash to keep up aggression, and the jumping slam creates more regularly spaced knives instead of the erratic pillars, though the attack is also much faster to compensate. With 2 masks of damage and a lot more aggression, Pure Vessel is the second boss that rests at Nightmare King Grimm's level of challenge. With that said, the dance is a little bit tougher and less natural to learn than Nightmare King Grimm's. Though there are health gates where Pure Vessel unlocks new attacks, the benchmarks of the fight are much less clearly defined than they were with the Nightmare King, and needing to reach the later part of the fight to practice learning new moves lacks the straightforward nature that Grimm's moveset used to use to make the fight feel non-stop. Especially since, in order to beat the Pure Vessel in its true arena, you have to first beat 9 late-game boss fights before you get a single attempt, Thankfully, you unlock the ability to rematch him once you've died to him your first time, which does let you practice him before you have to fight him at the end of the Pantheon. But where it loses me is that the Pure Vessel, like Nightmare King Grimm, wants you to smash into him over and over and over again until you've mastered the fight. But unlike Nightmare King Grimm, that moment when the Pure Vessel drops for the first time isn't a moment of grand victory, because you know you still have to go up and do the whole thing again at the end of the Pantheon. Because of this, that moment of release that you realize that you've done it, you've done what you thought was impossible, isn't as effective as it was with Nightmare King Grimm. Because by the time that you've won in the Pantheon, you've already likely beaten him a couple of times in practice rounds already, and it was just a matter of executing it correctly. To me, that isn't nearly as satisfying. As I mentioned, he does gain 2 new attacks rather than developing new infection attacks. The first is a focus spell that creates a large damage radius around himself, then creates smaller spawning ones that explode while he launches his next attack out. I like this one a lot because it provides a lot of well-hidden windows to punish, pressing towards him as the small bursts go off, using magic from a distance, or using invincibility to get through the first burst and keep him on the defense. It ends up being a really engaging move. The last move is a little bit less so, as he'll grow void tendrils that whip across the entire arena, having you jump over them to either wait a moment or pogo off his head. For our final move, this is also somehow one of his easiest ones to punish, which can slow down the otherwise breakneck tempo the fight tries to keep up. It's not a bad move, it's pretty satisfying to hit, but it's a strange final move for the game's final boss encounter to develop. Though the moveset is just as clean as Nightmare King Grimm, lacking the moment of explosive victory holds this level of challenge down a lot. Once you've beaten him, you get to do the 4th Pantheon until you beat him again. And once you beat him there, you get the DLC's real challenge, where the Pure Vessel just becomes another boss that you have to beat to reach the real final boss every single attempt. Because of that, I can't put the Pure Vessel above an A grade. I still love the atmosphere and challenge here, but the format of the fight in its true state stops it from reaching the game's highest peaks and ends up inviting more potential frustration than anything else. But if we want to talk about potential frustration, we have to talk about the Absolute Radiance, the final boss of the Pantheon of Hallownest and the Godmaster DLC. And when I said that the Radiance was objectively no longer the hardest boss, that's because the Absolute Radiance exists, and it's just the Radiance with more health, speed, phases, and threat. Attacks here come out even faster and overlap more, gaps are harder to find, and it feels like the Absolute Radiance teleports more frequently. And with more speed added into the mix, that platform phase has even more potential for some absolutely brutal RNG that can make the Absolute Radiance have the ability to take the player's chance at winning and minimize it drastically. The last phase is the most notable increase in difficulty. The climb, which was already fast-paced and exhilarating on its own, is now even faster, and a single mistake will often throw off your rhythm enough that recovering is a serious accomplishment, especially if you manage to recover from that at the end of the Pantheon of Hallownest. You have nerves of steel. And once you do make it past that, there's a new 6th phase where the Radiance teleports between 3 different spots where you're stuck on 2 small platforms, and she just summons the hard-to-see yellow orbs tracking you down. There's no downtime to heal here because it is non-stop. Often, players will be pogoing off the top of the screen, utilizing the fact that the orbs despawn off-screen in order to avoid taking damage. And that just feels like the aggression is so significant that something that feels like an exploit is the best way to stay aggressive. I can't figure out why, but I also feel like the yellow attacks are even harder to see here than they were in the first encounter. That might be the speed, that might be the change of where the black bars in the background are, but with the aggression so much higher and healing windows even harder to find, I often found myself more frustrated with the yellow orbs here than I was in the base game fight. But where the Pure Vessel suffered from the lack of a real victorious punch when you win, the Absolute Radiance by his nature is a boss that is borderline inaccessible for some players. I love to recommend Hollow Knight, but beating Absolute Radiance is not something I recommend players do unless they really want the challenge. Not only do I find this to be the hardest, most aggressive, and longest fight in the game, but to actually face it and get the achievement for beating it, you have to go through the entire Pantheon of Hallownest, which is a gauntlet of nearly every single boss in the game, all the way from Gruz Mother to the Dream Warriors to both versions of the major fights. Nightmare King Grimm appears in it, and every single boss from the DLC, including Pure Vessel, and you have to beat all of them to get a chance at this fight. Usually, an attempt at the Pantheon of Hallownest can take around 40 to 50 minutes for a casual player, which means facing the Absolute Radiance not only comes with the tension that 6 phases of boss brings, but the added pressure of an almost hour-long run back to the boss if you mess up. And since the Absolute Radiance is, like the Pure Vessel, designed to be practiced, that means that the player needs to realize what the Pantheon of Hallownest is, and practice every other boss enough that they can get through just to die to the Absolute Radiance for the first time, so they can go back, practice that hardest fight again until they feel confident enough to do it at the end of a gauntlet, then run through the entire Pantheon a second time, and stay calm enough to successfully make that practice pay off and take the Absolute Radiance down. Now, the finale of the DLC looks amazing as the knight evolves to a full void monster that tears the Radiance apart before consuming everything around it, but it is so much more demanding than anything else in the game. If you didn't do the Pantheon, winning and beating the Absolute Radiance, which is an accomplishment in its own right, just gets you the ending shown here, where the game fades to black before you get any real reward. Now, there is fun to be had here because the Radiance does really work as a super boss, but with the RNG aspects being even more regularly problematic and the challenge of the Pantheon, the role it serves in the game as a whole is not great. Because of this, I ended up having a really hard time grading the Absolute Radiance. And like with other controversial bosses, any grade that I put would be argued by someone. When I was practicing the Absolute Radiance, I was angry at the game, but once you have the fight mastered, it does end up serving as a really good culmination final challenge. Unless you're fighting it in the Pantheon of Hallownest, where the moment of victory feels like the player has been freed from this ancient curse rather than a final achievement. Because of that, I'm going to give it a B grade. As a boss individually, it might drift into A, but as a final challenge in the Pantheon of Hallownest, it would honestly rest much lower. But any of those lower grades feels unfair to the Absolute Radiance itself. But with that, we have gone over all 47 boss fights in Hollow Knight. The roster in this game is something else. In my opinion, 23 bosses scored an A or higher, meaning I see them as highlights of the game. If you somehow have made it through this entire video and enjoy action platformer Metroidvanias and have not played Hollow Knight, go and do that right now. Especially because overworld exploration in this game has moments just as memorable as the boss fights, and I didn't even touch on them here. But, as always, this is where our journey today will end. I'll see you in the next video, and hopefully have good news about Silksong existing. From a design standpoint, the where the health gets a decent increase and he starts to summon mobs, creating spiral waves of spears that ascend with Gorb. The biggest thing that works here with the moveset is how much of it is predictable follow-up. I bit my tongue. That serves as a major variation on a base game. Damn it.